Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning with Story 1: The Rise of Tenochtitlan, from Swamp to Empire. In the early 14th century, the Valley of Mexico was already a land of ancient stories and sophisticated city-states, a place where the sun shimmered off Lake Texcoco, and the hills bore witness to centuries of conflict, trade, and worship. Yet, amid this vibrant mosaic, one unlikely location stood out for its sheer impracticality: a small, marshy island with limited fresh water, unstable ground, and surrounded by a brackish lake. It was here, on this uninviting spit of land, that the Mexica later known as the Aztecs chose to build their capital. This was Tenochtitlan, the city that would become the heart of a great empire. But why choose a swamp? It wasn't destiny in the grand, mystical sense, it was necessity. The Mexica were migrants, latecomers to the region, looked down upon by more established powers like the Tepanecs and Acalhua. Pushed from place to place, they had few choices left. The valley's best lands were already taken. And then there was the vision: an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake which they reportedly witnessed on this island. Whether this was a real event or a symbolic memory encoded in later retellings, it offered something essential: a reason to stay. They did not have fertile fields or sturdy homes. Instead, they had mud, willpower, and time. And so, in the early 1300s, the first wooden huts rose. They stood on stilts driven into the lakebed, surrounded by canals and causeways. The settlers worked with what they had: reeds from the lake for thatch, mud for bricks, and stones hauled by hand from the mainland. Water was a constant problem. Salty and undrinkable, the lake water could not sustain a growing population. Over time, the Mexica learned to construct aqueducts to bring in fresh water and chinempas, the famous floating gardens. These were more than floating, they were carefully anchored and built on woven mats and mud, supported by willows and other hardy trees. With these innovations, they could grow maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers in the shallow lake. The chinempas, sometimes mistaken as simple rafts, were in fact more stable and productive than dry fields. Despite the hard labor, this was a period of quiet resilience. There were no emperors yet, no grand temples, just survival. Survival and the gradual building of alliances, marriages, and quiet schemes. As their city expanded, the Mexica offered their services as mercenaries, first to the Tepanecs. This was their gateway into the politics of the valley. They learned the region's languages, warfare, and rituals, absorbing its culture while preparing to one day surpass it. They were not always noble. They raided. They sometimes betrayed allies. They could be brutal, but they adapted. They were good at watching, and they remembered. By the mid-14th century, Tenochtitlan had grown enough to draw attention. It was no longer a swamp village. With each passing year, the causeways were extended, the canals more ordered. People began to come: traders, refugees, and others drawn by this unlikely rising star. There is something deeply mundane, yet deeply moving, in the image of laborers hauling baskets of mud day after day to build up a foundation. The story of Tenochtitlan is not just one of temples and sacrifice. It is one of digging, of engineering, of figuring out how to make something live where nothing should. We know little of the common builders. Their names are lost. But without them, without the people who spent years extending islands by hand, there would have been no empire. Their daily work formed the literal ground upon which later emperors would stand. Religious life was beginning to formalize. Small temples appeared, devoted to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the gods of war and rain. Every year, as Tenochtitlan grew, so too did its ambitions. Ceremonial cycles were recorded, and rituals timed with the agricultural calendar. These rituals were vital not just to honor the gods, but to legitimize the Mexica's presence in the valley. Still, they were not yet dominant. Their neighbors still considered them rude upstarts, culturally crude and politically naive. They were viewed with suspicion, even as their military skills became more valuable. And this is where the story begins to shift. The Mexica were waiting, and they were watching the Tepic Empire, whose strength began to falter in the early 15th century. A crack in the armor of their masters, and from these cracks, opportunity would emerge. But how does a small swamp town go from second-rate mercenaries to rulers of a vast empire? And what event would mark the turning point from survival to conquest? By the early 15th century, the Valley of Mexico was entering a period of instability. The dominant power, the Tepic Empire, centered at Azcapotzalco, had held sway for nearly a century. Its rulers, particularly Tezazamoc, a shrewd and long-lived leader, had balanced power through tribute collection and political marriages. But like all empires held together by force and calculation, cracks eventually appeared. When Tezazamoc died in 1426, a succession crisis erupted. His son Maxla seized power but lacked his father's cunning. He alienated allies and turned against former vassals, including the upstart Mexica of Tenochtitlan, who had grown both militarily competent and politically ambitious. Here, the Mexica saw their moment. At the time, Tenochtitlan was led by Itzcoatl, the fourth Tlatoni, or speaker, of the Mexica. Unlike the early leaders who had merely ensured survival, Itzcoatl was a visionary. He understood that Tenochtitlan could not remain a minor power indefinitely, especially if they continued to serve an empire in decline. He forged an alliance not through brute force but through diplomacy. He reached out to the rulers of Texcoco, particularly the exiled Prince Nezahualcóyotl, who had his own grievances against the Tepics. Nezahualcóyotl, an intellectual and poet as much as a strategist, had lost his city to the Tepics years earlier. With Tenochtitlan's military backing, he was promised the return of his throne. The two powers joined forces. Soon after, they recruited Tlacopan, another rival city-state to the Tepics, to form what would later be known as the Triple Alliance. Together, in 1428, they launched a full-scale rebellion against Azcapotzalco. The campaign was swift and decisive. The Tepics, overconfident and diplomatically isolated, fell. Azcapotzalco was burned and Maxla was executed. This was the defining moment. The Mexica had moved from servants to sovereigns. The alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan was at first portrayed as equal. Each city would share in the spoils of war and tribute from conquered territories. But in practice, Tenochtitlan began to assert dominance, particularly under Itzcoatl and his nephew, the future Emperor Moctezuma I. From here, expansion accelerated. Itzcoatl began a campaign of internal consolidation. He famously ordered the destruction of many old codices, written records kept by the Mexica, allegedly to eliminate politically inconvenient histories. In their place, new codices were created, ones that traced the Mexica lineage back to divine and heroic origins. Whether this was historical revision or cultural realignment, it established a new national mythos. The Mexica were no longer just squatters in a swamp, they were now a chosen people, guided by their patron god Huitzilopochtli, destined to rule the world. With these ideological foundations, the empire began to expand outward. Conquest was not just a military act, it was a cosmic duty. Each newly conquered region was required to pay tribute, not only in goods, maize, cacao, feathers, textiles, obsidian, and gold, but also in people. Captives were a cornerstone of both military prestige and religious necessity. The temples of Tenochtitlan required blood to sustain the gods, especially the sun, whose journey across the sky was thought to be fueled by sacrifice. But conquest did not always mean direct rule. In many cases, local rulers were left in place, so long as they remained loyal and paid tribute. The Mexica were masters of indirect imperial administration. The Triple Alliance developed a remarkably complex and adaptable system of tribute collection, often tailored to local resources. Meanwhile, Tenochtitlan itself began to transform. The city grew not just in population, but in grandeur. Itzcoatl and later Moctezuma I, who ruled from 1440–1469, undertook massive public works. The Templo Mayor, or Great Temple, was expanded. Causeways were reinforced and aqueducts built to supply fresh water from the mainland. Canals were deepened and widened to accommodate a growing system of canoe-based transport. In time, Tenochtitlan became one of the largest cities in the world, rivaling the size of Paris or Constantinople, with estimates of 200,000–300,000 people by the early 16th century. From humble reed huts to a city of stone pyramids, bustling marketplaces, and imperial courts, this was a transformation few could have predicted a century earlier. Still, beneath the surface of this success was a dependence on expansion. The empire's engine ran on conquest. Tribute sustained not only the economy, but also religious life. To keep the gods satisfied and to maintain the awe of the people, campaigns of conquest were continuous. This meant that the Mexica had to tread carefully. Their empire was not held together by iron roads or a standing army, but by fear, tribute, and belief. As long as these held, the structure remained intact, but any weakening of one could cause the entire system to wobble. And so they built, fought, and prayed, always mindful of the gods' favor and the delicate balance of power among their allies. In particular, the relationship between the three cities of the Triple Alliance began to tilt in favor of Tenochtitlan. Texcoco, though proud and once culturally dominant, began to play a secondary role. Tlacopan, smaller and less influential, was effectively a junior partner. By the late 15th century, the alliance was more symbolic than real. Tenochtitlan was the empire. And yet, even as the empire reached its zenith, shadows gathered at the edge of the valley. The Tlaxcalans, an independent and stubborn confederation to the east, had resisted incorporation for decades. Fierce warriors and proud of their autonomy, they represented the limits of Mexican expansion. The two powers engaged in what were known as flower wars, ritualized battles designed not for territory, but for the capture of prisoners to be sacrificed. These battles were as political as they were religious, reinforcing the mutual animosity and pride between the two sides. The Mexica also faced internal challenges. Tribute revolts were not uncommon. Some provinces required regular resubjugation. The cost of maintaining dominance was high, and the diplomatic balance fragile. Still, by the late 15th century, under leaders like Ahuitzotl and Moctezuma II, Tenochtitlan stood atop a vast network of tribute-paying provinces, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. The empire was at its peak. But the very structure that had made it powerful, its reliance on external tribute and internal myth, also made it vulnerable. What would happen if the gods stopped answering? What if the conquered peoples no longer believed in the divine right of the Mexica to rule? And what would happen when a new, unknown power arrived not from the mountains or lakes, but from across the sea? By the dawn of the 16th century, Tenochtitlan stood at the center of a world it had shaped through war, religion, and diplomacy. A city built atop a lake, connected by three massive causeways, dotted with temples, canals, gardens, and bustling markets, it was an island metropolis unlike anything in Europe or Asia. This was the world that the Spanish encountered when they arrived in 1519. They were strangers, Hernán Cortés and his men arriving not just with weapons and horses, but with an entirely alien worldview. They came not merely to explore, but to conquer, backed by a legal and religious framework that saw non-Christian empires as ripe for conversion or destruction. The Mexica had no precedent for such beings. They had seen strange men before, coastal traders, occasional shipwrecked foreigners, but nothing like this. The Spanish wore iron, rode animals no one had ever seen before, and bore weapons that could kill at a distance. But more than that, they seemed almost casual in their disregard for the sacred order of things. The ruler of the Mexica at this time was Moctezuma II, ruled 1500 to 1520. A deeply religious man, he had presided over the expansion of the empire to its greatest territorial extent. But he was also cautious, introspective, and increasingly concerned with omens. Years before the Spanish arrival, the Mexica had recorded strange signs: a comet, lightning striking the temple, and a vision of weeping women. In retrospect, these were read as omens of doom. Moctezuma's response to the Spanish arrival was not immediate hostility. Instead, he sent gifts. He hoped to understand them, perhaps to bind them through diplomacy, as he had with many other peoples. Some have suggested he believed Cortés to be Quetzalcoatl, the long-banished feathered serpent god, returning from the east. This theory has been debated heavily and may reflect later reinterpretations, but it underscores the spiritual confusion surrounding the moment. Meanwhile, Cortés quickly understood the fragility of the Mexica Empire. He exploited resentment. Many of the subjugated peoples hated the Mexica, particularly their demands for tribute and captives for sacrifice. The Tlaxcalans, fierce and fiercely independent, became Cortés' most critical allies. So too did other discontented city-states. The Spanish force was small, just a few hundred men, but it grew dramatically with the support of indigenous warriors who had been enemies of Tenochtitlan for generations. In late 1519, after a journey through the highlands, Cortés entered Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma received him with ceremony, housing him in a palace, offering him gifts and hospitality. But behind the ceremonies there was unease. Cortés quickly turned diplomacy into domination, taking Moctezuma hostage in his own city. From that moment, things began to unravel. The Spanish, unable to understand the spiritual gravity of the rituals, desecrated temples. A massacre during a festival at the Templo Mayor, carried out by Spanish soldiers while Cortés was away, triggered riots. When Cortés returned, the situation spiraled. Moctezuma attempted to calm his people but was struck possibly by stones thrown by his own subjects and died soon after, either from his injuries or assassination. The sources conflict. Then came La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. On June 30, 1520, the Spanish attempted to flee the city by night. The narrow causeways were choked with fighters. Canoes attacked from all sides. Many Spaniards drowned under the weight of stolen gold. Hundreds died. It was a rare and humiliating retreat. But the Spanish regrouped, and more importantly, they brought something with them far deadlier than swords or muskets: smallpox. Introduced likely by a single infected individual, the disease spread with horrific speed. The indigenous peoples had no immunity. Smallpox killed tens of thousands in Tenochtitlan alone. The social structure began to collapse. Priests, nobles, warriors all fell. The disease didn't distinguish between conqueror and conquered, believer and blasphemer. As the population reeled, the Spanish and their native allies returned. The final siege of Tenochtitlan lasted from May to August of 1521. It was brutal. The causeways were cut. The aqueducts were destroyed. Starvation set in. Cannibalism, once a religious act, now became an act of desperation. The defenders fought street by street, house by house. On August 13, 1521, the last Tlatoani surrendered. Tenochtitlan, the city built from swamp and vision, was burned and razed. The Spanish used its stones to build Mexico City, on top of its ruins. But the empire did not vanish entirely. The structures of tribute, the roads, and even many religious practices continued quietly, in secret, or in hybrid form. Indigenous scribes continued to write, now in the Roman alphabet. Families maintained fragments of their old ways, even as they baptized their children with Christian names. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked not just the end of a city, but the transformation of a continent. And yet, it is worth remembering that this collapse came not from moral failure or divine punishment, but from a convergence of vulnerability, over-reliance on conquest, deep resentment from the periphery, and exposure to alien disease. It was not fate, it was the result of choices, both brilliant and flawed. The empire had survived swamps, enemies, and centuries of hardship. It could adapt, but only to a point. Compass reflection, the long echo of empire. Tenochtitlan, at its height, was a marvel not because of its scale alone, but because of its origin. Few cities in world history have emerged from such inhospitable conditions to dominate an entire region in less than 2 centuries. Its founders were not born into power. They built it with mud, reeds, obsidian, and vision. What lessons can be drawn from its story? One might reflect on the nature of imperial power, how it is built on both faith and fear, or perhaps on how resilience, often born from marginalization, can become the seed of greatness, or how even the most powerful systems are, in the end, subject to fragility from within and without. Today, tourists walk through Mexico City, unaware that beneath the pavement lie the bones of canals, temples, and marketplaces. The Templo Mayor, once buried, has been partially excavated. You can stand there now, as traffic roars nearby, and see the stones that once received the blood of sacrifices. You can imagine the sound of drums and conch shells, the rows of merchants, the shimmering lake around the causeways. It is not gone. It sleeps beneath the city. And one cannot help but wonder if the Mexica had faced a different kind of stranger, or had time to understand what was coming. Would Tenochtitlan still be standing? Story 2. Daily life in a Maya city, Caba in its prime. The sun rises slowly over the Yucatan Peninsula. Its soft, golden light pierces through the thick canopy of ceiba and chiquizapote trees, casting elongated shadows across white limestone roads. These roads, Sacbiab, as the Maya called them, form a dense web of white veins radiating from the city of Caba, linking it to settlements dozens of kilometers away. In the humid silence of the jungle, life in Caba has already begun. It is around the year 750 CE, the height of the classic Maya period. Caba, nestled near several lakes in the dense subtropical forest, is among the most influential cities in the region. While Tikal and Calakmul dominate the southern lowlands through warfare and grand monuments, Caba has quietly thrived through trade, water management, and diplomacy. With a population estimated at 50,000 to 100,000, Caba is a sprawling, decentralized city. There is no grid plan, no central square around which everything orbits. Instead, Caba stretches organically, endlessly across the forest, its neighborhoods connected by raised limestone causeways, some as wide as 5 meters and as long as 100 kilometers. These are not just roads. They are the arteries of an empire built in stone and jungle. The day begins, the world of the commoner. For the average Maya living in Caba, the day starts before dawn. Families reside in simple, oval-shaped homes with thatched palm roofs, built on small limestone platforms. Walls are made of wattle and daub interwoven sticks plastered with a mix of clay and mud. The homes are humble, but each one forms part of a larger family compound with storage buildings, a garden, and maybe even a small shrine. Breakfast is a quiet affair: maize porridge addle, sometimes flavored with honey or cacao. Maize is not just food, it is the foundation of life, identity, and religion. In the Popol Vuh, the Maya creation myth, humans are formed from maize. To grow, cook, and eat, it is to participate in cosmic order. After the meal, men may head into the milpa's rotational forest gardens where maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers are grown. Others work as stonecutters, builders, or canoe traders. Women tend to the household, weaving cotton cloth on backstrap looms, grinding maize on metates, preparing food, or making ceramic vessels. Children play, but they also help. Even the dullest daily task, hauling water, carrying firewood, tending to small animals, reinforces their role in a tightly woven community. Few Maya are rich, but fewer still are destitute. In Kabah, wealth is displayed not through gold, which the Maya did not value as currency, but through access to exotic goods, obsidian from the highlands, jade from the Motagua River Valley, or feathers from the distant south. Most people do not see these materials. They are the purview of nobles and priests, whose homes rise on stone platforms and are often decorated with murals or glyphic inscriptions. Rituals and temples, the world of the divine. Though the city seems calm, ritual is constant. Even a farmer planting seeds may offer a few drops of corn gruel to the earth. The gods are everywhere: rain, sun, wind, death, and they must be fed, remembered, pleased. Kabah's temple complexes are smaller than Tikal's soaring pyramids, but no less sacred. The Nohak Mul Pyramid, the tallest in Kabah and among the tallest in the Maya world, looms above the treetops. It is not just a ceremonial center, it is a gateway to the heavens. Atop these temples, priests chant to Chak, the god of rain, or Itsamna, the creator deity. Blood offerings are made not only from captives but from the people themselves. A noble might pierce his tongue or genitals, collecting blood on strips of bark paper which are then burned as an offering. Pain becomes devotion. The gods, in turn, bring balance to the world. In the great ceremonial ball courts, players engage in the Maya ball game, a sport that combines athleticism, ritual, and cosmology. The ball, made of solid rubber, must be moved using hips, knees, and elbows, no hands. The game is not just a pastime. It can be used to settle disputes, display power, or reenact myth. Sometimes the losers or winners may be sacrificed. The stories vary. For the people of Kabah, the sacred and the mundane are not separate. The city is alive with meaning. Every path, every building, every act echoes with myth and memory. Trade and diplomacy, the web of the Maya world. Kabah's influence stems not from conquest, but from its strategic location and trade networks. Situated near several freshwater lakes, an anomaly in the otherwise arid Yucatan, it can support a large population. But more importantly, its Sakbiab link it to other cities. Yaxuna to the west, Ixil, Mayo, and even distant centers like Uxmal and Chichen Itza. These roads are not casual paths. They are monumental works of engineering, raised above the forest floor, paved with crushed limestone, and often aligned with astronomical principles. Some are built in straight lines stretching for dozens of kilometers, a feat requiring immense planning, labor, and coordination. Goods move constantly. Obsidian blades, ceramics, salt, jade beads, textiles, feathers, and even cacao beans, which are used as currency in some regions. Kabah maintains influence through marriage diplomacy. Royal daughters may be sent to distant courts, linking elite families across the Maya world. Inscriptions on steely, upright stone monuments record such unions. Unlike the centralized empires of the future, Maya cities like Kabah exist in a web of overlapping spheres of influence. War does occur, but it is often ritualized. Victory is about prestige, not extermination. Captives are taken, not cities. The goal is balance, not total domination. Magnifying glass tilted, write the scribes and the calendar keepers. In a room shaded from the sun, a scribe dips a reed into pigment and continues writing on a long strip of amate bark paper. He is recording the births of nobles, astronomical alignments, and offerings made to the gods. These records, written in elegant glyphs, are sacred. The Maya calendar is one of the most complex systems of timekeeping ever devised. Kabah's scribes maintain 3 simultaneous calendars: the 260-day ritual calendar, Tzolk'in, the 365-day solar calendar, Hob, and the long count, which records the days since the mythical creation of the world. This obsession with time is not abstract. The Maya believe that certain days carry certain energies. Ceremonies must be timed precisely. Agricultural cycles, coronations, and warfare all align with the calendar. History is cyclical, not linear. What has happened before will happen again. Scribes are not mere record keepers. They are priests, historians, and astronomers. Their work preserves memory and binds the present to the sacred past. Monkey evening descends, sounds of the jungle. As the sun lowers over the jungle canopy, the city quiets. Smoke rises from cooking fires. The air is thick with the sound of insects, birds, and howler monkeys. Drums may echo in the distance, perhaps a ritual, or simply practice for tomorrow's ceremony. Families eat tamales, boiled beans, and roasted squash, seasoned with chili and lime. Some have meat turkey, dog, or deer, but most rely on plant-based meals. By torchlight, storytellers recount legends of the hero twins, who journeyed to the underworld to outwit the gods of death. Children listen, eyes wide, lulled by the rhythm of ancient myth. Above them, the stars emerge. The Milky Way Zibalba, the black road to the underworld, arches across the sky. The cosmos is alive, and the people of Kaaba are a part of it, woven into its cycles, its stories, its silences. Waxing crescent moon, unresolved thought. For all its beauty and complexity, Kaaba would not last. Within a century or two, the city would fall into decline, its Sakbiab overtaken by forest, its temples forgotten. But what caused this decline? Was it war, drought, political fragmentation, or something else? And how did the people of Kaaba experience that slow unraveling, day by day, without knowing they were living through the twilight of their city? While the mornings in Kaaba begin with quiet rhythms of work and prayer, the midday hours reveal the deeper structures that hold the city together. Kinship, hierarchy, diplomacy, and tradition. Kaaba's strength is not only in its roads and temples, but in its people's ability to weave themselves into a living network of memory, duty, and identity. In this section, we delve deeper into what lies beneath the surface, how family life shaped the structure of power, how political authority was both sacred and fragile, and how the Maya of Kaaba understood themselves in a world governed not by kings, but by obligations to the ancestors, to the gods, and to time itself. Family, lineage, and social order. In Kaaba, family is the cornerstone of society. Extended households, patrilineal compounds live together in clusters, organized around a shared platform. These residential groups are not random collections of relatives. They represent lineages, with each member knowing their place in a generational hierarchy. Elders command deep respect. A grandfather may be no ruler, but his word carries authority simply by virtue of age. To grow old in Kaaba is to embody memory, to remember floods, bad harvests, wars, and treaties, and to serve as a living bridge to those who came before. Names matter. Most Maya children are named based on their birthday in the 260-day Tzolk'in calendar, which means every name carries cosmic weight. A child's identity is not separate from the rhythms of the universe. Some names are believed to align with fortune, others with hardship, but all are accepted, as every life plays a role in the celestial story. Men are raised to farm, trade, and if they are of noble blood, perhaps one day rule or command warriors. Women, while less represented in inscriptions, play essential roles. They manage the home, perform domestic rituals, weave textiles, and pass down oral histories. Some noblewomen marry into other city-states, forging alliances that span hundreds of kilometers. And in rare but significant instances, women rule. Kaaba is one of the few Maya cities where female rulers appear in the archaeological record. One such figure, often referred to as Lady Kayawil Ajo, ruled sometime in the late 7th or early 8th century. Her image appears on stele standing tall, clothed in ceremonial regalia, holding the serpent bar of kingship. She is not a consort or priestess, but a full-fledged ruler. Her reign challenges the notion of a rigidly patriarchal Maya society. Classical the Ajo, kingship and sacred power. At the top of Kaaba's political system stands the Ajo, or Holy Lord. But unlike monarchs in later European societies, The Agile is not simply a ruler, he is a mediator between worlds. His authority is rooted in divine legitimacy, reinforced through ritual, lineage, and public performance. When an Agile ascends the throne, he is often shown in stele seating upon the mat, a symbol of political authority. He does not rule absolutely. His power is checked by tradition, advisors, and the memory of ancestors. He must perform his role correctly or risk cosmic disorder. This is not mere superstition. In a city so deeply tied to the calendar, to prophecy, and to signs from the sky, a ruler who misaligns ritual and time can be blamed for droughts, famines, or war. The Agile must embody the city's soul, and like all embodiments, this can be burdensome. Kaba's rulers commission stele and altars, covered in glyphs and images, not to glorify themselves, but to situate their reigns within the unbroken continuum of time. These records link their actions to those of their ancestors, reinforcing legitimacy through narrative. The past is never gone, it is performed and reperformed, etched in stone. It is also worth noting how absence plays a role. When no stele are erected for a period, it may mean a political crisis or a loss of authority. Silence, in Maya history, often speaks louder than words. Foreign relations and the art of alliance. Kaba does not exist in isolation. Its Sakbiab-raised limestone roads are arteries of connection, not conquest. They stretch to other cities, including Yaksuna, more than 100 kilometers to the west. Archaeologists now believe these roads were more than functional, they were symbolic, possibly sacred pathways aligned with stars or cardinal directions. To travel a Sakbi is to move not just through space, but through meaning. Diplomatic missions travel these routes, envoys bearing gifts, proposals of marriage or tribute. Codices now lost to time would have recorded the terms of agreements, the conditions of trade, and the birthdates of newly bonded royal children. The exchange of prestige goods plays a central role in diplomacy. Items like green jade, stingray spines, used in bloodletting, and obsidian blades signal both wealth and religious devotion. To give such gifts is to make a promise to bind yourself in reciprocity. Conflict, when it occurs, is rarely about territorial control. Instead, it is about reputation, about asserting dominance in the ceremonial sphere. Cities raid each other not for land, but for captives living offerings for their gods. Victory enhances a ruler's status, defeat diminishes it. Yet for all the occasional violence, the Maya world is not a war-torn wasteland. It is a network of city-states negotiating survival through a balance of force, tradition, and storytelling. Magnifying glass tilted left writing, memory, and the glyphic record. One of the greatest achievements of the Maya civilization is its writing system, a complex combination of logograms and syllabic signs, capable of conveying nuanced, poetic thought. In Kaba, this writing appears most vividly on stele, but it also lived on codices, bark paper books kept in temples or noble homes. Scribes are highly trained, sometimes born into families of record keepers. They learn to paint the glyphs, to align them with astronomical cycles, and to incorporate metaphor and myth. A good scribe does not merely record, they interpret. A single stela might contain 3 or 4 layers of meaning, literal events, symbolic imagery, calendrical significance, and mythological resonance. Reading it requires not just literacy, but initiation. Some records speak of rituals conducted on dates that echo past events, reinforcing the cyclical nature of time. Others record the naming of children, the dedication of a temple, or the passage of Venus across the sky. Writing is more than memory, it is binding. What is recorded in stone cannot easily be changed. The glyphs give permanence to power, to belief, and to lineage. But writing is also fragile. Much of what we know about Kaba comes from these carved records. The codices, being organic and easily destroyed, have mostly vanished, burned by time, weather, or the later arrival of Spanish missionaries. The sacred landscape and water's silent power. Kaba's geographic success is due not only to its roads or diplomacy, but to one simple, vital factor: water. The city is located between two freshwater lakes, Lake Kaba and Lake Macangsok, a rarity in the Yucatan Peninsula, where natural water sources are scarce. These lakes support fishing, transport, and agriculture. In a land defined by drought and scarcity, control of water equals stability. The lakes are also sacred. They may serve as portals to the underworld, part of a cosmology where caves, cenotes, and lakes are entrances to Xibalba, the Maya realm of the dead. Offerings are thrown into these waters: pottery, jade, even human remains, gifts to the spirits below. Divers in modern times have recovered hundreds of artifacts, suggesting that these lakes were not merely resources, but ritual sites of immense importance. Around the lakes, temples rise. Some align with solstices or equinoxes. Others may align with Venus, a celestial body of immense significance to the Maya. Its cycles were tracked with precision, and events such as warfare or coronations were timed to its risings and settings. To walk through Kaba is to walk in a landscape of meaning. Every tree, every path, every shadow carries a memory, a purpose, or a prayer. First quarter moon, unresolved thought. Even as Kaba thrived in diplomacy, agriculture, and ritual, the foundations were shifting. Other cities like Chichen Itza began to rise in the north, asserting new models of power. Trade patterns shifted. New gods, new languages, new political alliances emerged. What choices did Kaba's rulers make in these moments of transition? Did they resist the change or try to adapt? And when the roads grew quiet, what remained of the bonds that once held the city together? By the turn of the 9th century CE, the stone causeways of Kaba still shimmered white under the tropical sun, and the city's temples still stood tall above the jungle canopy. Life continued as it had for centuries: rituals performed, maize harvested, the stars tracked with silent reverence. And yet something was changing. The signs were not immediate or dramatic. There were no great fires, no single conquering army, no cataclysmic event to carve into stone. Instead, the decline of Kaba came as a slow unthreading of the very systems that once sustained it: its diplomatic networks, economic ties, and sacred timing. This section explores how cities like Kaba may have declined not in sudden ruin, but in the more haunting way that civilizations often do: by fatting. Tornado shifts in power, the rise of new centers. By the late 8th and early 9th centuries, new city-states began to rise in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, most notably Chichen Itza and Uxmal. These cities introduced different models of leadership and ritual expression, some of which diverged from the traditions practiced in Kaba. Chichen Itza, for example, began adopting Toltec-inspired iconography, feathered serpents, militarized imagery, and architectural features that suggested influences from central Mexico. The rise of Chichen Itza likely disrupted long-standing trade routes and pilgrimage networks that had once passed through Kaba. Kaba, while once a regional hub, may have found itself increasingly peripheral. Its Sakbiab, once thriving arteries of commerce and diplomacy, began to lose their utility as political alliances realigned. The problem was not that Kaba failed, but that the world around it evolved faster than its traditional structures could adapt. Bricks monuments as silence, the end of stele. One of the clearest archaeological signs of Kaba's decline is the absence of dated stele after the 9th century. These stone monuments, once carefully carved to commemorate royal accessions, victories, and calendar rituals, begin to disappear. In Maya cities, the absence of record is a record in itself. It suggests not necessarily destruction, but perhaps a loss of resources, skilled artisans, or the political cohesion necessary to commission public works. When stele stop being carved, it's often a sign that the ruling elite have lost their grip on ritual authority, that the stories are no longer being told in stone. Life may have continued in Kaaba, but the great performances of time, the processions, bloodlettings, and celestial alignments that once knit the community together were no longer recorded. The past, once meticulously chronicled, slipped into oral memory or quiet forgetting. Droplet environmental fragility, water, soil, and strain. Kaaba's lakes had always been its strength, but they were also a limited resource. Population pressure may have led to overuse of water, deforestation, and soil depletion. The Maya Milpa system slash-and-burn rotational farming is sustainable over long periods when practiced with sufficient fallow time. But if fallow periods shrink due to population growth or political pressure to increase food production, the system can collapse. Soil becomes exhausted. Yields drop. There is also evidence of droughts occurring during this period. Climate records from lakebed sediments suggest a period of decreased rainfall around the 9th century, a drought that may have lasted for decades. In a region already dependent on controlled water access, this could have triggered food shortages, migrations, and internal unrest. Religious leaders, who were responsible for ensuring rainfall through ritual and calendar alignment, may have faced crisis of legitimacy. If the rains didn't come, perhaps the gods had turned away or the priests had failed. Repeat button fragmentation and forgetting. As central authority waned, Kaaba may have fragmented into smaller, competing neighborhoods or regions. With no strong central ruler to enforce tribute collection, maintain roads, or coordinate rituals, the city would have become more localized, more inward-looking. Some elite families may have relocated to more prosperous centers like Chichen Itza, taking their skills, wealth, and connections with them. Others may have simply stayed, living in slowly crumbling compounds, maintaining traditions in miniature. Temples were no longer repainted. Stone steps cracked under plant roots. The Sakbiab, once the pride of the city, were overtaken by forest vines, their white stones buried beneath fallen leaves. Kaaba did not fall so much as it quietly dissolved into the jungle that had always been both its protector and its threat. And yet people remained. Archaeological evidence suggests that Kaaba was never truly abandoned. Small-scale habitation likely continued for centuries. The lakes were still there. The soil could still be coaxed into giving. Rituals may have continued in smaller, more intimate forms. Ancestors remembered at hearth altars instead of temple summits. The grandeur faded, but the human thread did not break. Compass afterlives, Kaaba in the post-classic and beyond. By the post-classic period, 900–1500 CE, Kaaba was no longer a dominant city, but it may have remained regionally important. Some evidence suggests renewed activity or partial reuse of certain sites during this later era, possibly under the influence of neighboring powers. However, by the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, Kaaba had long since passed out of historical memory. It was not among the active Maya cities that the conquistadors recorded. There were no great battles or conversions here, just forest. Kaaba became one of countless lost cities swallowed by the jungle, remembered only in oral histories, if at all. It would not be until the 19th and 20th centuries that explorers and archaeologists began to uncover the remnant stele covered in glyphs, temples hidden under earth and tree, and causeways stretching endlessly through untouched forest. The modern discovery of Kaaba, beginning in earnest in the 1920s and 1930s, revealed not just a city, but a worldview. The stele, once read by priests and nobles, were now studied by linguists and epigraphers. Glyphs once used to record offerings were used to reconstruct timelines. Temples once meant to commune with gods were scanned with LiDAR and GPS. In rediscovering Kaaba, we began to remember a people who never really vanished, only fell silent. Reflection: what remains when a city is forgotten? Kaba's story is not one of tragedy, but of impermanence. Civilizations are often imagined in terms of triumph or collapse, glory or doom. But in reality, most cities follow a more subtle trajectory. They grow, adapt, fragment, and recede. Kaba did all of these. Its people were not destroyed. They simply returned to a different rhythm, a life without temples, without stelae, without alliances stretching across the horizon. A smaller, slower life. One rooted more in family than in empire. Today, visitors walk among the ruins. They climb the worn steps of Nohak Mall. They peer at stelae eroded by time, try to decipher glyphs, listen to birdsong and the rustle of palm fronds. Few realize they are walking on Sakbiab, ancient roads that once carried diplomats, pilgrims, and traders through a living forest empire. Kaba is silent now, but it is not gone. Its roads still lead somewhere, not to other cities perhaps, but to memory. And in the end, is that not the true power of history, not to preserve, but to return, again and again, in quiet footsteps on stones once laid by forgotten hands? Story 3. The Inca Road System Empire on Foot. The Andes are unforgiving, a region defined by extreme scorching deserts, impenetrable jungles, frigid mountain passes, and deep, narrow valleys. For most civilizations, such terrain would be a barrier. But for the Inca Empire, it became a spine, a foundation on which they built one of the most extensive and improbable road systems in the ancient world. Stretching over 24,000 miles across modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, the Quijapac-Nian, the Royal Road, was not merely a path through mountains. It was a lifeline, connecting an empire of over 10 million people, most of whom would never see a wheel or a written word. Instead, they had feet, stone, and astonishing coordination. This is the story of how an empire moved. Know the challenge of geography. The Inca Empire Tawantinsuyu, or the Four Regions, rose in one of the most geographically difficult environments ever inhabited by a large civilization. From the coastal deserts of western South America to the high Andean peaks and into the edges of the Amazon rainforest, the diversity of terrain was staggering. And yet, by the early 15th century, under the leadership of emperors like Pachacuti and later Tupac Inca Yupanqui, the Inca began transforming this environment into a network of imperial control. At the heart of this control was not chariots or roads for wagons; those didn't exist. Instead, it was a vast, interconnected network of footpaths, stone-paved highways, rope bridges, staircases, and tunnels, built and maintained entirely by hand. This network is often compared to the Roman road system, but unlike the relatively even terrain of Europe, the Inca had to carve paths into cliffs, suspend bridges over canyons, and construct switchbacks up vertical rock faces. At times, roads climbed over 5,000 meters, 16,000 feet above sea level, through snow and thin air, where even breathing is a challenge. Despite this, the roads were remarkably consistent in quality and alignment. Railway. The structure of the road system. The Quijapac-Nian consisted of two primary north-south highways. One along the coast, through the deserts and valleys. One through the highlands, cutting across mountain passes and valleys. These were connected by hundreds of transversal routes, allowing people to move between ecozones, climates, and regions. This was more than convenience, it was strategic. Different ecological zones produced different goods: potatoes and quinoa in the highlands, maize and cotton on the coast, tropical fruits and coca in the lowlands. The road system enabled the redistribution of these goods, often controlled and managed by the state. The roads varied in material and width depending on the terrain. In populated regions, they were often paved with stone, up to 6-8 meters wide. In rural or mountainous areas, they could narrow to simple dirt paths. Bridges were essential. There were no boats or ferries in the highlands; rivers were crossed via Huayhuachaca bridges, woven rope suspension bridges made from iku grass, capable of spanning rivers 100 feet wide or more. These were rebuilt annually by local communities. Stone stepping paths placed across shallower rivers. Causeways and aqueducts, allowing roads to pass over wetlands or streams. In places where mountains rose too steeply, stone staircases were carved directly into the slope, hundreds or thousands of steps, still intact in many places today. The overall effect was a deep integration of the empire, physically and socially. Every province, every outpost, every corner of Tawantinsuyu was connected to Cusco, the capital considered the navel of the world. Mail the Chasquis, runners without rest. The road system did not rely on carts or beasts of burden for long-distance transport. The llama, the Inca pack animal, could only carry about 50-70 pounds and could not be ridden. There were no horses until the Spanish arrived. Instead, the Incas relied on human runners, known as Chasquis. Chasquis were elite messengers, young, fit men trained to sprint across mountainous terrain. They were stationed at intervals of about 6 to 9 kilometers, 4 to 6 miles, in relay stations called tambos. These rest stations were spaced just far enough apart to allow a Chasqui to run at full speed, hand off the message or package to the next runner, and rest before beginning again. Thanks to this relay system, messages could travel over 250 miles per day, faster than many European mail systems of the time. But what exactly were these messages? There was no written language in the Inca world, not in the traditional sense. Instead, messages were carried in the form of quipus, intricate cords of knotted string that recorded numerical data and perhaps other abstract information. The Chasqui system allowed the Inca government to receive information on crop yields, tribute deliveries, military needs, rebellions or unrest. And not just information. The Chasquis could carry goods, tools, ceremonial items, and even fresh fish to the emperor in Cusco from the coast, kept cool with bundles of mountain snow. They were the bloodstream of the empire, running day and night, up and down impossible terrain, ensuring that the Inca always knew what was happening and could respond. Camping tambos, inns of the Andes. Along the road system, at regular intervals, were the tambos way stations that served as inns, storage depots, and administrative outposts. Tambos varied in size. Smaller ones were just for Chasquis. Larger tambos near provincial centers could house troops, administrators, or travelers. Some had storehouses stocked with food, tools, clothing, and weapons, all maintained by local communities as part of the Mida system, a labor tax that sustained the empire. There was no monetary economy in the Inca world. Instead, citizens paid their taxes in labor, building roads, farming state lands, maintaining infrastructure. Tambos were a direct result of this system. They allowed the Inca state to project power, sustain its armies, and manage resources without markets or money. For the traveler, tambos offered shelter and resupply. For the government, they were nodes of surveillance, logistics, and military readiness. Classical integration and identity. The road system wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of unity. As the Inca expanded, conquering or absorbing neighboring peoples, they often built roads into newly annexed territories as one of their first acts of integration. This did two things. It physically connected new regions to Cusco, allowing tribute and information to flow. It symbolically showed that the empire now included them. The road was a ribbon tying all peoples together. As people traveled these roads, whether carrying goods, attending ceremonies, or fulfilling labor obligations, they entered the larger world of Inca identity. They encountered Inca architecture, state-sponsored religion, and imperial rituals. The road system in this way was not just infrastructure. It was a social technology, reinforcing common values and centralized power in a world without printing, coins, or conquest myths. Waxing crescent moon, unresolved thought. And yet, what happens when the runners stop running? When the tambos are abandoned and the bridges fall into the river? How does a network designed for movement respond to invasion to a new kind of enemy? One who does not walk but rides, who carries disease in his breath and metal in his hands. In the next section, we'll explore how the road system enabled the Inca to build one of the most tightly controlled empires in history, and how it became both a strength and a vulnerability in the face of the Spanish conquest. The genius of the Inca road system wasn't just in its engineering, it was in its ability to govern. In a world without iron tools, currency, wheels, or writing in the traditional sense, the Incas managed to organize millions of people across a rugged, fragmented landscape. And they did it with stone roads, human memory, and ritualized labor. In this section, we examine how the Quiapac was more than a network of paths. It was a system of economic redistribution, imperial surveillance, cultural unification, and soft power. The roads were the physical and ideological framework of the Inca Empire. Briefcase labor as tax, the mita system. At the heart of Inca society was the mita, a form of rotational, state-organized labor. In the absence of coinage or traditional taxes, citizens of the empire, except the elderly and infirm, paid their dues to the Sapa Inca, the emperor, not with money, but with work. Mita obligations varied based on one's region and skills, but they included farming state-owned lands, building or repairing roads, bridges and terraces, mining precious metals, serving in the army, weaving textiles for state use, maintaining tambos and warehouses. Because of the road system, these workers could be moved efficiently where they were needed. Skilled stonemasons from Cusco could be sent to far-off provinces to build temples. Soldiers could be rotated to frontier regions with minimal delay. Importantly, the mita was not enslavement. While it was mandatory, it was also reciprocal. The state provided food, clothing, and shelter to workers during their service. It was a deeply ingrained cultural expectation, rooted in Andean traditions of communal labor and reciprocity, Aini. The roads made the mita function. Without them, it would be impossible to coordinate the labor of a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire across thousands of kilometers. Derelict state storehouses and strategic reserves. Along the road system, particularly near tambos and administrative centers, stood the Chalcas Inca state storehouses. These were stone or adobe structures, often built in clusters, where the empire stored dried maize, quinoa, and potatoes, freeze-dried meat, charqui, textiles from cotton or alpaca wool, weapons and tools, coca leaves, ceremonial items. The contents of the Chalcas were not for sale or profit. They were strategic reserves, managed by Inca administrators. The state distributed them during famines, ceremonies, or in support of military campaigns. The system allowed the empire to smooth over local shortages, offer food to workers fulfilling mita duties far from home, and even reward loyalty among provincial elites. It also discouraged rebellion by challenge the authority that feeds you during lean years. To function efficiently, however, this system required the movement of goods between production zones and storage depots. The roads made that possible. A farmer in the highlands might send surplus potatoes to a coastal storehouse via llama caravan. A chasqui might carry a quipu message reporting on food levels, prompting redistribution. It was logistics on a massive scale, accomplished without ledgers or spreadsheets. Information without writing, the quipu and memory networks. The Inca Empire functioned without a writing system as we know it, but that doesn't mean it lacked information storage. Enter the quipu or quipu, bundles of knotted strings made of cotton or camelid fiber. A quipu could contain hundreds of strings, each with knots tied in precise locations. The placement, direction, spacing, and color of the knots represented numerical data, often in base 10 systems. While quipus were mostly used for accounting, recording census data, harvest yields, and labor obligations, there is growing evidence they may have also encoded non-numerical information, perhaps even narratives or names. These records were interpreted and created by quipucamiocs, trained record keepers, often stationed at tambos or provincial centers. They memorized the data associated with each quipu, and their oral testimony gave the strings meaning. A quipu was not a standalone object, it required a human interpreter, a living archive. The road system connected these quipucamiocs. When the Sapa Inca wanted a census of a distant province, messages went out by chasqui. Local administrators compiled the data into quipus. Couriers then delivered them back to Cusco, where higher-level quipucamiocs interpreted and compared the reports. In a sense, the roads enabled a mobile bureaucracy, an empire managed through oral tradition, collective memory, and networks of trained specialists. The military on the move. The Inca road system was also a military machine. While the empire preferred diplomacy and strategic marriages, it was no stranger to conquest. Rebellious provinces were swiftly punished. Rival states like the Chimu were eventually absorbed. Internal revolts, often caused by local elites resisting central control, were a constant concern. The roads allowed the Inca military to move troops rapidly. A call for reinforcements could go out by chasqui and be answered in days. Army units made up of conscripted men from various regions could march with relative ease, supported by tambos stocked with food and clothing. The army itself was highly organized. Troops were grouped in decimal units, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Uniforms, weapons, and supplies were standardized. Engineers built temporary roads, camps, and bridges in new territories. Once a region was pacified, the Inca often left Mitmacuna settlers loyal to the empire to colonize the area and integrate it more fully. They brought Inca language, customs, and farming techniques. The roads didn't just follow conquest, they cemented it. Classical roads as ritual and propaganda. To walk the roads of the Inca Empire was not just a journey, it was a statement. Pilgrimages were common. People traveled to Cusco, the sacred center, to participate in imperial ceremonies. They walked to temples, sacred mountains, apis, and oracles. The roads themselves were often ritualized, cleaned regularly, guarded by shrines, and sometimes aligned with celestial events. Certain stretches were reserved for nobility or religious officials. Others were used in imperial processions, such as during the Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun. The Sapa Inca might travel partway along the road, flanked by attendants and musicians, in an embodied performance of state power. Road construction also served ideological purposes. By building a road through a newly conquered region, the Inca symbolically absorbed it into the empire. The road became both a physical tether and a cosmic link to the imperial center. Much like Roman aqueducts or Chinese walls, the Quipucac Nyan said, without words, "We are here, we are powerful, we are watching." Unresolved thought. And yet, for all its reach and elegance, the Inca road system had a flaw: it required constant maintenance and collective will. Without workers to clear brush, repair bridges, and stock tambos, the roads quickly became impassable. So when the Spanish came, and the Mita collapsed, and the Chasquis were killed or enslaved, what became of the empire that once walked across the sky? In the next section, we'll witness how the Quipucac Nyan shaped the conquest of the Andes, and how the same roads that once unified an empire were used to unravel it. In the year 1532, a small group of heavily armed Spanish soldiers marched into the highlands of Peru, led by Francisco Pizarro. They came not in thousands, but in less than 200 men riding horses the Inca had never seen, wielding steel weapons the Inca had never imagined, and carrying diseases the Inca had never been exposed to. They were strangers in a vast empire, and yet they would reach its heart, Cusco, in a matter of weeks. They did not bushwhack through jungle or scramble blindly over the Andes. They marched on roads, Inca roads. The Quijapac Nian, built over generations to link the empire together, now carried its conquerors. In this final section, we explore the final chapter in the story of the Inca road system, how it enabled the Spanish conquest, how it persisted even after the empire's fall, and how it endures quietly and sometimes invisibly beneath the modern world. Direct hit, a precise invasion. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire was neither a campaign of overwhelming force nor a slow siege. It was a surgical dismantling of a complex but centralized system. At the time of Pizarro's arrival, the empire had just endured a devastating civil war between Atahualpa and Huáscar, two rival brothers who fought over succession after the death of their father, Huayna Capac. The empire was politically fractured, emotionally exhausted, and deeply vulnerable. But even in disarray, the empire's infrastructure was intact. Pizarro and his men moved quickly, using the royal roads to navigate from coastal landing sites through mountain valleys and into major cities. These roads, built with no knowledge of Spanish horses or carts, were perfectly suited to small infantry units. The Spanish quickly learned how to commandeer tambos and co-opt local guides. Indigenous allies, some of whom had been previously conquered by the Inca and resented them, provided information and support. Atahualpa was captured in Cajamarca, far from Cusco, during what was meant to be a peaceful diplomatic meeting. Despite offering a ransom of a room filled with gold and silver, he was executed in 1533. The roads then carried the Spaniards to Cusco, which they took with minimal resistance. The Inca, despite having tens of thousands of troops, could not coordinate a response in time. The Civil War had shattered trust between regions, and the centralized communication system based on chasquis and quipus collapsed without leadership. Ironically, the same system that had once enabled Inca dominant speed, centralized control, and efficient redistribution became a weakness when external disruption outpaced internal cohesion. Derelict collapse and continuity. After the conquest, the Quijapac Nian did not disappear overnight. In fact, the Spanish found it immensely useful. They reused it for military movement, missionary travel, and colonial administration. Spanish roads in the Andes were often little more than repurposed Inca roads, sometimes widened or modified for horses and wagons. Missionaries traveled the routes to reach remote Andean communities. Silver from Potosi, one of the richest mines in the world, was hauled along former Inca paths to the coast, then shipped to Europe. But while the roads remained, the people who had built and maintained them were not so lucky. The Mita system was co-opted and corrupted by the Spanish. What had once been a rotational duty sustained by reciprocity became forced labor, often in mines rather than public works. The term Mita itself was retained, but its meaning became twisted under colonial rule. As communities lost their ability or desire to maintain the roads, decay set in. Bridges collapsed, tambos were abandoned. Lands that had once supplied state storehouses were taken by Spanish landowners or repurposed for colonial agriculture. The chasquis, no longer protected or paid by the state, disappeared. In just a generation, the living road system, the humming network of runners, laborers, pilgrims, and priests went quiet. Candle memory in stone. Even in their decline, the roads never fully vanished. In rural communities, older generations still remembered where the roads went. Farmers knew where ancient stones poked through their fields. Villagers walked along sections of road, now overgrown, to reach their neighbors. Some sections of the Qiuhpac Nian continued to be used for centuries, especially in remote or mountainous areas where no better infrastructure existed. In other cases, the roads became part of oral tradition. Stories passed down through families spoke of ancestors who once walked to Cusco or who carried messages in the name of the Inca. Though the empire was gone, its paths were still real. And then in the 20th century, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians began to study the roads anew. Satellite images revealed long-forgotten sakbas winding through mountains. LiDAR scans uncovered roads buried under centuries of vegetation. Interviews with Quechua-speaking elders provided missing links. In 2014, UNESCO designated the Qiuhpac Nian a World Heritage Site, recognizing not just its physical scale, but its cultural and historical significance. Today, efforts are underway to preserve, reconstruct, and reconnect the surviving stretches, bringing together 6 modern nations that once formed parts of Tawantinsuyu. Hiking boot walking the past. If you were to walk the Inca roads today, in places like Ollantay Tambo, Chaquiquirao, or along the famed Inca Trail to Machu Picchu, you would find more than just a trail. You'd find precisely cut stone paths, still aligned with seasonal rains, drainage channels that still function, stone retaining walls that hold hillsides steady after 500 years. You'd pass by ruins of tambos, staircases carved into sheer rock, and lookout points designed to view vast valleys at once. You'd also pass locals who still use the road, not as tourists, but as descendants walking to markets, to festivals, to farms. To walk these roads is to enter a living archive, one not kept in books or temples, but beneath your own feet. Sunrise over mountains reflection, the empire that moved without wheels. The Inca Empire is often remembered for Machu Picchu, for its conquest by the Spanish, or for its lack of writing. But perhaps its most remarkable legacy is motion, its ability to move people, goods, knowledge, and power over vast, vertical landscapes without the tools we often consider essential. No wheels, no beasts of burden strong enough to carry humans, no paper, no iron. And yet they moved. They moved because of a collective belief in the empire, because of shared labor, ritual, and responsibility, because the roads didn't just go from a to be, they carried meaning. Every step reinforced the idea of unity, of order, of Tawantinsuyu. When the Spanish came, they moved too, using those same roads to spread an entirely different vision of power. But the stone beneath their boots was still Inca. Final thought. Today, we often measure empires by what they leave behind: monuments, texts, treasures. But what if the greatest legacy of the Inca is something quieter? A path, a set of steps, a line through the mountains. Still there, still walked. And what does it say about us? That in a world of satellites and highways, some of the most enduring roads ever built were carved by hand, without maps, without metal, in the thin air of the Andes. Story 4. Aztec tribute and taxation, the backbone of empire. If the Aztec Empire is remembered for anything beyond its soaring pyramids and ritual sacrifice, it should be for its staggering ability to extract, organize, and redistribute wealth. By the early 16th century, the empire centered in Tenochtitlan did not directly administer every city-state it had conquered. It didn't plant flags or occupy distant lands with standing armies. Instead, it built its empire on something more efficient, more sustainable, and far more lucrative: tribute. Not paid in coins, but in feathers, cacao, cloth, salt, obsidian, gold dust, slaves, and food. The tribute system was the engine of the Aztec economy, the reason for its expansion, and the unseen force behind its ceremonial grandeur. This section explores how the Aztecs built an empire not just of temples and warriors, but of lists, baskets, carriers, and counters, an administrative machine that extracted the wealth of Mesoamerica, one bundle at a time. Scroll. What was tribute? In its simplest form, tribute, known as tequitl, was the payment of goods and services from a conquered or subordinate altepetl city-state to the Central Mexica Authority, often headquartered in Tenochtitlan. But this was not a form of taxation in the modern sense. It was a complex system of political subordination, economic redistribution, and religious duty. It was how the empire fed its people, clothed its armies, built its temples, and demonstrated its power. The Mexica Aztecs referred to their expanding empire as the Triple Alliance, a pact between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Each member received a share of tribute from the subject regions, though Tenochtitlan, being the most powerful, claimed the lion's share 2/5, compared to 1/5 each for the other two. By the time of the Spanish arrival, over 400 city-states paid tribute, some every 80 days, others quarterly or annually, depending on their agreements or level of subjugation. Tribute was itemized. Every expected item was recorded in pictorial tribute lists, showing not only the object but the quantity and its specific origin. These codices were bureaucratic masterpieces, produced by trained tlacuilos, scribes, and painters, and used by administrators to track who owed what and when. These records were precise. One city might owe 4,000 mantles of cotton cloth, 20 baskets of chili peppers, 2 rubber balls, 1 jade bead, 40 clay pots, 1 bundle of feathered war costumes. Failure to pay could result in punishment, raids, or renewed conquest. Basket. What was paid? The nature of tribute goods. There was no uniform currency in the Aztec world. While cacao beans and cotton cloth were sometimes used in markets as units of exchange, the tribute system relied on a broad diversity of goods tailored to the unique products of each region. Here's a look at some of the most common tribute items. Cotton cloth, huipil, tilmatli, the backbone of tribute. Cotton was not grown in the highlands around Tenochtitlan, making it a valuable lowland product. Cacao beans, grown in the warm coastal areas, used both as a drink and a de facto currency. Turquoise, jade, and obsidian, rare and valuable, used in elite crafts and religious offerings. Feathers, especially quetzal feathers, which were iridescent green and highly symbolic. Salt, harvested from saline lakes and coastal pans. Rubber balls, used in ritual ball games and also as raw material. Foodstuffs, maize, beans, amaranth, squash, tamales, and chili peppers, delivered regularly to feed urban populations. Human labor or captives. Some regions provided tribute in people as slaves or sacrificial victims for religious ceremonies. Craft goods, pottery, sandals, painted gourds, baskets, musical instruments, and more. Tribute was not just material. It reflected economic specialization, ecological diversity, and social hierarchy. Some areas produced high-status ritual goods, while others sent basic commodities in massive quantities. Receipt. How was tribute organized? Once a city-state was conquered or allied through diplomacy, it was assigned a tribute assessment. This assessment took into account the region's resources, its population, and its relationship to the empire. Assessments were then recorded in codices, which served as both tax ledgers and maps of obligation. Tribute was collected by local rulers, not Aztec officials. The Mexica allowed local governments to remain in power so long as they continued sending tribute. This method created minimal administrative burden while keeping local elites dependent on imperial favor. Goods were collected at regional centers and delivered to Tenochtitlan, often by porters who carried goods on their backs in netted bundles called cacaxtli. Long lines of porters could be seen arriving on causeways, entering the city like clockwork. Once in the capital, tribute was distributed to temples for use in religious rituals and festivals, to the army for uniforms, food, and weapons, to the nobility to reward loyalty and status, to the market where surpluses could be sold or bartered. Tribute also funded public works, temples, causeways, canals, and more. It fed workers, supported artisans, and allowed the state to sponsor festivals that lasted for days. Classical calm through control. The tribute system wasn't just about wealth, it was about control. By requiring cities to pay regular tribute, the Mexica maintained a subtle psychological pressure on their empire. Cities were constantly reminded of their subordinate status not through occupying troops, but through ritualized submission. Many tribute deliveries were accompanied by ceremonies in which goods were presented to officials with formal speeches, offerings, and gestures of humility. These were symbolic acts of loyalty and fear. In some cases, cities that remained autonomous were invited or pressured to pay tribute as a sign of alliance. The choice was clear: pay and keep your freedom, or resist and face conquest. This allowed the empire to expand rapidly without needing to garrison every outpost. Tribute was cheaper than conquest. However, this also created a fragile imperial shell. Most provinces didn't see themselves as part of a unified empire. They were simply paying to be left alone. Cityscape Tenochtitlan, the tribute capital. Standing in the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, you could see tribute in action. Dozens of products: cotton, cacao, salt, cloth, feathers, obsidian piled high on mats or displayed on stands. Much of it had arrived as tribute, redistributed into the economy. The city's survival depended on this influx. Tenochtitlan, though surrounded by lake water, had limited agricultural capacity. It relied heavily on chinampas, floating gardens, and tribute to feed its hundreds of thousands of residents. The empire created redistribution, warehouses, massive storage complexes near the great temple to hold tribute goods. These stored surplus food, ceremonial items, and valuables for future festivals or crises. It was a finely tuned system. And yet, all it took to collapse it was interruption, something as simple as war, famine, or foreign invasion. Unresolved thought. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they were astonished at the abundance and organization of the Aztec capital. But they also noticed something else: resentment. Many provinces, exhausted by the relentless tribute demands, saw an opportunity. When Cortés marched inland, he found eager allies among the empire's tributaries. The question is, was the Aztec Empire ever truly unified? Or was it always a system held together by baskets, ledgers, and the threat of return? The Aztec Empire was not built only by warriors or priests. It was held together by counters, scribes, local rulers, and a quiet system of administration that ensured that goods moved on schedule, people fulfilled their duties, and the temples remained supplied with everything from feathers to food to captives. In the absence of coinage, centralized banks, or a standing army to patrol the provinces, the tribute system functioned as a kind of invisible scaffolding. It turned a loose network of conquered city-states into a working, if uneasy, political whole. This section explores how tribute was recorded, collected, and enforced, and how the tools of empire were not swords or sacrifices, but inked pages, woven bundles, and walking men with aching backs. Open book tribute in the codices. The Aztecs kept no alphabet or phonetic script, but they possessed an elaborate and expressive pictographic system. The tribute codices, some of which survived the Spanish conquest, are among the most detailed administrative records of any pre-modern empire. The most famous of these is the Codex Mendoza, created in the early years of Spanish colonization at the request of the new viceroyal administration. Indigenous scribes, many trained under Mexica traditions, illustrated how tribute flowed through the empire. Each page displays the name of a conquered altipedal city-state, accompanied by a series of drawn items, each representing a tribute item. Every product is counted in groups using dots and flags, a dot for 1, a flag for 20. A jaguar skin, 2 turquoise diadems, 20 clay pots. They're all drawn, counted, cataloged. It was a visual bureaucracy, designed for a society in which literacy was confined to the elite and administrative classes. Some codices were ceremonial, but many were functional. Painted on ammetal bark paper or animal hide, these books were public records. They could be carried, consulted, and compared. They provided not only evidence of obligation, but also protection for the payer. If a tribute item was wrongly demanded, a record could settle the dispute. These codices show us that the tribute system was not just top-down, it was negotiated, monitored, and remembered. Package: how tribute was collected. The collection of tribute followed a clear process, one that mirrored the structure of Aztec society itself. Assessment: when a city-state was conquered or brought into alliance, the central authority sent emissaries to assess its economic potential. What crops could it grow? What crafts did it produce? What luxury goods could it provide? Based on these evaluations, a tribute quota was determined. Documentation: the quota was written into pictorial tribute lists, sometimes stored both locally and in Tenochtitlan. These served as binding agreements. Collection: tribute was collected locally, overseen by the altipedal's ruler or appointed tribute officials. Goods were gathered from local farmers, artisans, and households, each responsible for a portion. This internal redistribution placed the burden on local elites, which often bred resentment, particularly when the central state increased demands. Transportation: tribute items were carried. There were no wheels or draft animals. Porters, tileme, walked in caravans, often escorted by local officials to ensure safety and compliance. Tribute might travel dozens or even hundreds of kilometers, arriving via stone causeways into Tenochtitlan. Reception and verification: in Tenochtitlan, tribute was received by imperial stewards who cross-checked the items against the pictorial records. Goods were then sorted, some going to temples, others to warehouses, and some redistributed as payments to nobles and officials. Busts in silhouette: who paid and who didn't. The Aztec tribute system was designed to extract maximum value while maintaining minimum interference, a delicate balance of coercion and pragmatism. Most tribute-paying regions were recently conquered. Conquest almost always resulted in new tribute obligations. Resource-rich regions with cotton, cacao, feathers, salt, or obsidian were highly valued. Politically important regions at strategic points, like trade routes or frontiers, were often bound by tribute to ensure loyalty. Interestingly, not all city-states paid tribute. Some, like Tlaxcala, remained independent and hostile, successfully resisting Aztec domination. Others, particularly in central Mexico, were absorbed early and exempted from tribute, perhaps in exchange for military service or elite marriages. There were also multi-tiered tribute relationships. A dominant city might collect tribute from its own satellites and pass part of it along to Tenochtitlan. This meant that even tribute could be delegated, creating a chain of dependencies and resentments. Cross-enforcing compliance: what happened when a city failed to deliver? Punishment could be swift and symbolic. Military raids: non-compliant provinces were often reminded of their obligations by force. These were not full-scale wars, but quick, devastating strikes, burning crops, taking captives, killing nobles. Captive taking: beyond the material cost, cities risked having their young men and women taken as tribute captives, destined for sacrifice at festivals like Tlaxcala or Panquetzalistli. Loss of autonomy: chronic defaulters might see their rulers replaced with Mexica-friendly officials, their temples defunded, or their nobility stripped of honors. But open rebellion was rare. The threat of destruction, combined with the political prestige of alliance, kept most city-states in check. And for many, paying tribute was still preferable to being conquered outright. Tribute and the state economy. It is tempting to assume the Aztec economy was entirely extractive, but the tribute system also had redistributive functions. Temple festivals, funded by tribute, provided free food, drink, and entertainment to the urban population, especially the poor. Warriors, particularly those who achieved capture quotas, were rewarded with tribute goods, mantles, sandals, slaves. Artisans who worked in imperial workshops received food and housing, paid for with tribute staples like maize and beans. Nobility received gifts, often items not produced locally, to maintain their loyalty. This meant that while the empire siphoned wealth from its periphery, it also circulated it, maintaining a semblance of balance. Tribute was not just hoarded, it was consumed, redistributed, and displayed. But the system was rigid. It depended on reliable collection, efficient transport, and political loyalty. A disruption at any point, crop failure, rebellion, foreign invasion, could unravel the entire chain. Fire the seeds of discontent. To understand the vulnerability of the Aztec Empire, we must see the tribute system not only as a source of strength, but as a source of resentment. By the early 1500s, many provinces were overburdened. The expansion of the empire had created greater demands not just in quantity, but in ceremonial complexity. Major festivals required more captives, more costumes, more cacao, more cloth. The average farmer in some provinces may have spent a significant portion of his labor growing crops he would never eat, or weaving cloth he would never wear. When Hernan Cortés arrived in 1519, he quickly discovered that many provinces, Totonacs, Tlaxcalans, Incas, were eager to turn against the Mexica, not because they loved Spain, but because they hated tribute. They had paid for years. Now they wanted to see someone else pay. Waxing crescent moon, unresolved thought. The Aztec tribute system was a masterpiece of organization, but it was never truly a union. It was a system of obligations maintained by fear, ritual, and tradition. So when the center fell, when Tenochtitlan was besieged, and its causeways cut, what happened to the ledgers, the baskets, the tribute carriers? When no one came to collect, did the provinces feel grief or relief? When the Spaniards first marched into the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they encountered not just a city but a system. The towering temples of Tenochtitlan, the shimmering causeways, the feathered warriors and jeweled priests, they were all supported by a vast, quietly humming bureaucracy of tribute and redistribution. It was a system so entrenched that to most within it, it probably seemed eternal. But empires built on obligation are fragile. When the messengers stop coming, the baskets stop arriving, and the codices are forgotten, the structure doesn't collapse all at once. It begins to hollow out until only the outer form remains. This final section follows the disintegration of the Aztec tribute system, how the Spanish used it, broke it, and ultimately transformed it into the foundations of their own colonial administration. Crossed first contact, tribute as leverage. When Hernan Cortés arrived on the coast of modern-day Veracruz, he was greeted by emissaries of Moctezuma II bearing lavish gifts: gold, cotton cloth, feathers, cacao. The emperor, unsure of the Spaniards' nature and fearful of omens, hoped tribute would appease them. To the Spaniards, this was confirmation. The empire was wealthy and already accustomed to payment. Tribute wasn't an alien idea, it was opportunity. As Cortés marched inland, he quickly learned of the resentment many regions held toward Tenochtitlan. Tributary states like the Totonacs and the Tlaxcalans had long borne the burdens of Aztec taxation without the rewards of imperial favor. For them, the Spanish were not just invaders, they were leverage. They offered alliances, soldiers, guides, and food. In return, they hoped to topple the system that had drained them for generations. As Cortés approached Calula, Huixotzinco, and eventually Texcoco, he presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator of those crushed by tribute. Even if this was a lie, it was one that many were ready to believe. Cid escaped the siege of the center. Tenochtitlan was the hub of the tribute system. Its markets were stocked with goods delivered by dozens of subject cities. Its temples were funded by grain and cloth collected from thousands of villages. Its ceremonies, wars, and pageantry were possible only because the system functioned with relentless regularity. So when the siege began in 1521 and the roads were cut, the canals blocked, and the aqueducts severed, the tribute stopped. Suddenly, the city could not feed its population, supply its priests and warriors, maintain its social and religious festivals, redistribute food to the poor, reward loyalty with gifts. Starvation set in quickly. Disease already spreading worsened. The lack of incoming tribute wasn't just a logistical problem, it was a cosmic rupture. For the Mexica, the daily and seasonal flows of goods and gifts were part of the spiritual balance. Without tribute, without the ceremonies it funded, the gods themselves might abandon the world. And when the city finally fell, in August 1521, it was not just a military defeat. It was the collapse of the tributary cosmos. The tribute system under Spanish rule. But empires are practical. The Spaniards, in their first years of rule, quickly realized that the existing tribute system, while fragile, was also incredibly useful. Rather than invent a new system from scratch, they co-opted the Aztec model. The tribute lists, the local collection methods, and even the porters continued. The Spanish simply changed who received the goods. They called the new system the encomienda. Under this model, Spanish conquerors were granted the right to receive tribute and labor from specific indigenous communities. In theory, they were also responsible for protecting and converting the people under their charge. In practice, the encomienda often became a system of exploitation. Whereas under Aztec rule, tribute had been tied to cosmic and political obligations, under Spanish rule, it became a tool of personal enrichment. Payments in cloth and maize were now demanded alongside gold and silver. Encomenderos expected tribute not once a year, but continuously. The original tribute codices were sometimes translated into Latin letters, with Spanish officials relying on indigenous scribes, many of them trained in pre-Hispanic tradition, to maintain order. In this way, the structure survived, but the meaning collapsed. Chart decreasing collapse of the indigenous economy. Over time, however, the tribute system began to break down not because of rebellion, but because of demographic catastrophe. Between 1520 and 1600, over 80% of the indigenous population of central Mexico died mostly from smallpox, measles, typhus, and famine. This meant entire communities vanished. Tribute obligations became impossible to meet. Local political systems lost their leaders. Traditional craft production, textiles, pottery, featherwork, declined or disappeared. The specialized tribute items like jaguar pelts, quetzal feathers, or painted gourds became harder to obtain. Fewer porters remained to carry goods. Tribute that had once been cultural and religious in nature became brutal and extractive. In response, Spanish officials began switching from in-kind tribute goods to monetized tribute requiring villagers to pay in currency. But the indigenous people had no money. This created cycles of debt peonage and forced labor. By the mid-17th century, the tribute system that had once supported the Aztec Empire had become unrecognizable, a shattered relic of a world erased by disease and greed. Compass traces in the present. Even today, echoes of the tribute system remain. In some rural parts of Mexico, community labor obligations known as tequio are still practiced. These are rotational duties, often tied to public works or festivals, and are considered a form of communal reciprocity. Certain village festivals continue to rely on voluntary tribute from community members' offerings of food, cloth, or candles to support public ceremonies. These acts are not seen as burdens, but as honors, recalling an older rhythm of giving that predates both empire and colony. In museums and archives, the Codex Mendoza, the Codex Matricula, and other pictorial tribute lists continue to be studied not only as historical records, but as windows into a world where economics and cosmology were one and the same. Classical reflection, tribute as identity. To the Aztecs, tribute was not just a system of taking, it was a system of knowing. To pay tribute was to know your place in the world, your city, your region, your gods, your duties. It was a reminder of conquest, yes, but also a thread that connected hundreds of diverse communities in a vast and living web. Tribute structured the calendar, funded the festivals, clothed the warriors, and fed the poor. It was a language spoken not in words, but in bundles and baskets. Its collapse did not merely end an empire, it unraveled a worldview. And yet, for all its coercion, the tribute system left behind traces of structure, record-keeping, and communal obligation that endured, even as the world around it changed forever. Final thought. Today, we often associate tribute with oppression or exploitation. But can a system of obligation also bind people together? Can giving, when done in rhythm with the seasons and shared belief, become more than a tax? And if a society is built on baskets and memory, not coins and ledgers, when the baskets are empty and the memory fades, what remains? Story 5. Maya Astronomy and the Long Count Calendar. To live in the world of the ancient Maya was to live in a universe shaped not just by stars and seasons, but by calendars so intricate they measured not only the passage of days but the very rhythm of existence. From the highlands of Chiapas to the jungles of the Petén, across great cities like Tikal, Capan, Palenque, and Caracol, the Maya observed the heavens with a kind of obsessive precision. Their astronomy wasn't isolated science, it was religion, politics, memory, and timekeeping, all folded into one. But among all their systems of time, one stands apart: the long count calendar. In this first section, we begin our journey into how the Maya watched the skies, why they counted the days, and how they understood the cosmos not in decades or centuries, but in cycles of thousands of years, reaching back into mythical time. Calendar: 3 calendars, 1 world. To understand the long count, we first need to understand that the Maya didn't use a single calendar. They tracked time using 3 interlocking systems, each with a different purpose. Tzolk'in, a 260-day ritual calendar composed of 20-day names and 13 numbers. This calendar was used for divination, naming children, and scheduling ceremonies. Hab, a 365-day solar calendar made of 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 extra nameless days, Wayeb, considered unlucky. This calendar aligned with the seasons, especially agricultural cycles. Calendar Round, a cycle of 52 solar years, created by combining the Tzolk'in and Hab. Like a complex odometer, it took 52 years for a specific date to repeat. But these systems couldn't account for historical or mythological dates beyond a single human lifetime. For that, the Maya developed something unparalleled in the ancient world: the long count calendar, a system capable of recording dates thousands of years into the past and future. Scroll: what is the long count? The long count is a base 20 vigesimal and base 18 calendrical system that counts the number of days since a mythical starting point. August 11, 3114 BCE in the Gregorian calendar. That date wasn't arbitrary. According to Maya cosmology, it marked the creation of the current world, the beginning of the Fourth Age after 3 prior worlds had been destroyed. Dates in the long count are recorded as 5 numbers separated by periods. 13,000. This represents 13 bakduns. Each bakdun equals 144,000 days. 0 katuns, 7,200 days. 0 tons, 360 days. 0 winnels, 20 days. Kayins, 1 day. So, 13,000 equals 1,872,000 days, after 0,000 equals August 11, 3114 BCE. That brings us to December 21, 2012 CE, a date that, as we'll see, created no small amount of misunderstanding in the modern world. But for the Maya, it simply marked the end of a great cycle and the start of a new one. The calendar and the cosmos. To the Maya, time was not linear, it was cyclical. The passage of days wasn't a road, it was a circle, turning endlessly. Just as the sun rose and set, just as maize grew and died and grew again, so too did ages pass and return. This cyclical view is reflected in their mythology, especially the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Kayich Maya. The gods had tried to create humanity multiple times. The first men were made of mud, but they dissolved. The second were made of wood, but had no souls. Only the third, made of maize, were successful. Each of these attempts marked a world age. So when the Maya recorded a date like 90000, 435 CE, they weren't just documenting time. They were placing themselves within a sacred cosmic sequence, measuring not just days, but the distance from divine creation. Telescope astronomy in stone. The Maya didn't just invent abstract calendars, they observed the heavens with great care. Their cities were astronomical instruments. E-groups' architectural complexes aligned to the solstices and equinoxes appear across the Maya world. From these, priests and astronomers could track the rising of the sun along the horizon. Observatories like the rounded tower at Chichen Itza allowed detailed measurements of Venus, the moon, and other celestial bodies. Stelae and inscriptions show the Maya tracked solar eclipses, lunar phases, and the movement of Mars, Jupiter, and especially Venus. The planet Venus was of particular importance. It was associated with the god Kaawiel and with warfare. Its heliacal rising, the first visible rising before dawn, was often used to time battles, political events, and rituals. The Maya even predicted Venus cycles with uncanny accuracy. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian books, includes a Venus table that tracks the planet's movements over a 584-day synodic period, nearly matching modern astronomical measurements. Shinto ritual and the role of the calendar priest. Maya society was deeply ritualized, and calendar priests held enormous responsibility. These specialists, called Akayin, were tasked with tracking calendar days, scheduling festivals and ceremonies, naming children and divining their fates, determining auspicious dates for planting, warfare, or construction. Each day in the Tzolk'in calendar had its own character, defined by a number 113, and a day name like Ajo, Ik, Kayan, etc. These were not passive markers, they were living energies, and each combination was believed to carry specific influence. To be born on 4 Ajo meant something different than being born on 9 Ik. Just as some days were auspicious for marriage, others were for sacrifice or healing. Through these systems, the Maya created a cultural map of time as rich and complex as any map of rivers or mountains. Inscriptions, time written in stone. Unlike many other Mesoamerican cultures, the classic Maya wrote history. They carved long count dates into stelae, temple walls, staircases, and altars. A typical Maya inscription might read, "On 9/13/000 in the month of Pax, the Holy Lord of Kapan, Waxiclajun Yuba Kaawil, ascended the throne." These were not simple records. They were acts of power. By anchoring their actions to specific moments in cosmic time, Maya rulers linked themselves to the gods, the ancestors, and the deep structure of the universe. To govern was not merely to rule over land or people. It was to participate in the ongoing cycle of creation. Waxing crescent moon, unresolved thought. The Maya built one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems in the ancient world, but they didn't use it to forecast the end. They used it to place themselves in context, to remember where they came from, and to anticipate how the cycles would turn again. So why did we misunderstand them so badly? Why did 2012 become a global obsession? And what happens when an ancient calendar, created to honor the gods, is interpreted through the lens of modern fear? In the early 21st century, the world briefly turned its attention to the ancient Maya not for their achievements in astronomy, architecture, or agriculture, but because of a number, 130000. That date, corresponding to December 21, 2012 in the Gregorian calendar, marked the end of a great cycle in the Maya long count calendar. For some, it was misunderstood as a prediction of the end of the world. News reports, books, documentaries, and films latched onto the date, spinning apocalyptic scenarios of planetary alignment, solar flares, and cosmic rebirth. But for the Maya, 130000 was not the end. It was a renewal. In this section, we look at the misunderstood 2012 prophecy, what the long count actually represents, and what it tells us about how the Maya thought about time, memory, and cosmic continuity. Scroll the structure of the long count, cycles within cycles. Let's revisit the structure of the long count system. It is a base 20 counting system, vigesimal, modified for certain units. The primary time units are 1 kn equals 1 day, 1 winal equals 20 days, 1 ton equals 360 days, 18 winals, 1 k-aton equals 7,200 days, 20 tons, 1 b-acton equals 144,000 days, 20 k-atons. So a long count date looks like this: 130000, which means 13 b-actons, 0 k-atons, 0 tons, 0 winals, 0 k-ins. It marks the completion of 1,872,000 days, or about 5,125 years, from the mythical creation date. 00000 equals August 11, 3114 BCE. The Maya believed this was the start of the current world age. When that count reached 130000, it simply reset, starting a new cycle. 00000 again, initiating a new great cycle. This was no different from an odometer rolling over, or the turning of a giant celestial wheel. So why did 2012 become such a phenomenon? Newspaper 2012. Misinterpretation and modern myth. The roots of the 2012 apocalypse myth are found not in ancient glyphs, but in modern speculation. In the 1960s and 70s, scholars like Michael D. Coe noted that the long count calendar would complete a major cycle in December 2012, and that the Maya likely viewed this as a time of transition or importance. Later, fringe writers and pseudo-historians, some inspired by New Age spirituality, others by doomsday themes, began proposing cataclysmic interpretations. Books like The Mayan Prophecies and 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl popularized the idea that the Maya predicted a dramatic transformation, be it a cosmic alignment, the return of ancient gods, or the end of civilization. Hollywood joined in with the film 2012, portraying global destruction on a massive scale. The narrative sold. It was mysterious, ancient, marketable. but almost none of it came from Maya sources. In truth, only one known inscription directly mentions the 130000 date, a fragmentary carving from Tortuguero Monument 6 in Tabasco, Mexico. The text references the future date and suggests that Balan Yacht Kea, a deity associated with transitions, would descend or appear. The meaning is vague, but nowhere does it imply destruction or apocalypse. For the ancient Maya, this was a moment of ceremonial importance, not a doomsday warning. Milky Way, the Maya view of time. So how did the Maya actually think about time? Time for the Maya was layered, cyclical, and personal. The Tzolk'in gave every individual a birth sign, shaping their destiny. The Hab helped align agricultural and civic life with the solar year. The calendar round created cycles that connected generations through repetition. The long count allowed events to be dated across centuries and millennia, linking rulers and myths to the moment of creation. In Maya inscriptions, rulers often timed coronations, monument dedications, or rituals to fall on significant calendar anniversaries, especially those aligning with previous world ages. By doing so, they didn't just rule in the present, they anchored themselves in the cosmic history of time. They believed that events echoed and repeated. A king might claim that his reign began exactly 1,600 years after the creation of the world, not as coincidence, but as destiny. This view of time fostered a sense of continuity, not finality. Time didn't end, it turned. Calendar in daily and political life. The Maya calendar wasn't just a tool of kings and priests. It shaped daily life for commoners, too. Farmers aligned their planting and harvesting with specific Hab days. Midwives and healers used the Tzolk'in to name and advise newborns. Builders timed construction projects with celestial events. Ball games were played on days associated with the gods of sacrifice or rebirth. Even political rebellion was timed. In the post-classic period, some Maya city-states used calendar anniversaries to launch insurrections, believing these dates were cosmically auspicious. Time wasn't neutral. It was alive and it carried instructions. Telescope precision without telescopes. Maya astronomical tables, particularly in the Dresden Codex, show a deep understanding of planetary cycles. Venus. The Maya tracked its 584-day synodic cycle with a precision of less than a single day's error over several centuries. Eclipses. Codices contain eclipse tables that helped priests predict lunar and solar eclipses, which were seen as powerful omens. Lunar cycles. Maya inscriptions carefully note the age of the moon, often tracking it with a supplemental series of glyphs. Solar zenith. At cities near the Tropic of Cancer, such as Kapan and Uxmal, buildings were aligned to mark the days when the sun was directly overhead, an important moment in tropical astronomy. All of this was done without telescopes, clocks, or compasses, using only observations, architecture, and careful record-keeping. The power of timekeeping. In Maya civilization, those who kept time held power. The calendar priest, the astronomer, the ruler who aligned his reign with the cosmos, these figures had access to knowledge others did not. They could predict eclipses, interpret omens, and claim legitimacy not just from bloodline, but from cosmic order. This gave the calendar a political edge. If a rival misaligned a ritual or failed to honor a significant date, it could be seen as a failure of divine favor, a weakness. Ruling well meant ruling in harmony with the calendar. It meant knowing not just what to do, but when. Waxing crescent moon, unresolved thought. The Maya tracked time with astonishing depth, not to forecast doom, but to stay in balance with the world. So why do we fear cycles ending? Why do we see finality where others saw renewal? And what might we learn from a people who believed that the end of one cycle was simply the beginning of the next? By the height of the classic Maya period, circa 250–900 CE. The great cities of the lowland jungle weren't just centers of politics or trade. They were celestial machines built and aligned to echo the movements of the heavens, to mark the passage of time, and to bind the earth to the sky. Through careful observation and meticulous planning, the Maya created urban spaces where architecture, ritual, and astronomy merged into a living calendar. Every sunrise, solstice, and eclipse was woven into the life of the city not as background noise, but as the very rhythm of the world. This final section explores how Maya astronomy shaped architecture, ceremony, and political authority, and how, even in ruin, these cities still track the sky. Cityscape cities as calendars. One of the most striking features of Maya urban planning is how many temples, palaces, and plazas were aligned with astronomical events. Solstices, summer and winter. Equinoxes, spring and fall. Zenith passages of the sun, when it passes directly overhead. The rising and setting of Venus. The movement of the moon and eclipses. These alignments weren't accidental. Cities like Kapan, Uxmal, Tikal, Yaxchilan, and Chichane, Itza contained buildings positioned to capture light or shadows on key calendar days. The effect wasn't just visual, it was ceremonial. In a society where time was sacred, cities became stage sets for enacting the calendar. Shinto, the E-groups, tracking the sun. One of the most common architectural forms used for solar tracking was the E-group, a specific arrangement of structures named after Group E at Uaxactun, where it was first identified. Typically, an E-group consists of a long platform on the eastern side of a plaza, with 3 small temples aligned north, center, and south. A single western structure, often a pyramid or viewing platform. From the western building, observers could watch the sun rise over the aligned temples. On the summer solstice, it rose over the northern temple. On the equinoxes, it rose over the central temple. On the winter solstice, it rose over the southern temple. These alignments helped Maya astronomers calibrate their Hab calendar, the 365-day solar cycle, and predict seasonal changes crucial for agriculture. Many cities across the Maya lowland Sable, Aguatka, Nakam have E-groups, suggesting a shared knowledge tradition. Sunrise, the zenith sun, and ritual. At latitudes between the Tropic of Cancer and the equator, the sun passes directly overhead twice a year, a phenomenon known as the solar zenith passage. For the Maya, these days were exceptionally important. They often coincided with the start of the rainy season, agricultural rituals, especially for planting maize, ceremonies invoking Chak, the rain god. In cities like Kapan and Tikal, stele and temple doorways were constructed so that on the zenith day, the sun would shine directly through an opening, or cast no shadow at all, signifying the moment of celestial balance. To observe this was to be in tune with the gods. Zenith rituals may have included sacrifices, music, offerings of maize or cacao, and recitations of creation myths, reaffirming the bond between people, land, and cosmos. Watching Venus. Venus, the morning star and evening star, was a powerful celestial force in Maya belief associated with warfare, kingship, the god Kaelul or Chak Ek. The Dresden Codex includes a Venus table spanning hundreds of years, tracking its 4 key phases. Morning star, heliacal rising. Disappearance at superior conjunction. Evening star, heliacal setting. Disappearance at inferior conjunction. Maya rulers often timed military campaigns to align with Venus's reappearance as a morning star, considered an omen of aggression. Some inscriptions describe attacks launched on the day of the first appearance of Venus, suggesting a celestial sanction for conquest. Temples like El Karakal at Chichane, Itza, appear to be observatories for tracking Venus's movement. Its rounded, tower-like structure has multiple windows aligned to Venus's risings and settings. The precision required for this tracking without telescopes is a testament to generations of cumulative observation. Time and legitimacy. In Maya politics, the ability to read the heavens and mark time was not just religious, it was political power. Rulers often staged public events, coronations, sacrifices, building dedications on significant dates in the long count or calendar round. By doing so, they linked their reigns to cosmological cycles, legitimizing their authority. For example, a king might be crowned exactly 13 Atons, around 256 years, after a previous significant event. A stela might be erected to commemorate the completion of a Bakdun or Aton, with a public ceremony to mark the moment. Rituals invoking the founding of the world, 00000, were used to reinforce the idea that the ruler was part of the cosmic design. In this way, kings became keepers of cosmic order not by force alone, but by timing. The calendar's collapse in afterlife. When classic Maya cities began to decline in the 9th and 10th centuries, their calendar systems didn't disappear overnight, but something changed. Monument inscription stopped being dated with long count dates. New forms of writing emerged, less formal, more regional. Calendar use continued in ritual and agricultural life, but the great stelae were no longer erected. Some scholars argue that this marks a loss of confidence in the central cosmic order. Others see it as a shift from elite state-centered timekeeping to more localized, flexible practices. Even under Spanish rule, the Tzolk'in calendar survived in many Maya communities. To this day, in parts of Guatemala and Chiapas, daykeepers known as Aztecs still count the 260-day calendar, offering guidance and conducting rituals. The Maya calendar never ended, it adapted. Compass echoes in stone. Walk through a ruined Maya city at dawn, and you can still feel it. The long shadow of a temple at equinox. The stillness before sunrise on a zenith day. The alignment of stone staircases with the path of Venus. These were not coincidences, they were deliberate, measured, sacred. Even in silence, these cities keep time. Sunrise over mountains reflection, a universe measured in days. The Maya saw time not as a burden or a ticking clock, but as a living structure with layers, meanings, and responsibilities. They did not fear the passage of time. They walked it, marked it, honored it. Their calendar was a bridge between the gods and the people, the stars and the soil. We live in a world of digital clocks and forgotten anniversaries, but the Maya remind us that time can be ceremonial, embodied, even sacred. They did not just measure the world. They wove themselves into it. Final thought. In a time when we often rush through days without noticing the sky, what might we gain from looking up? From counting not just hours but meanings? And what would it mean to live again, by the rhythms of sun, moon, and memory? Story 6. Inca agricultural terracing feeding the mountains. At first glance, the high Andes of South America appear nearly uninhabitable, jagged ridges, narrow valleys, thin air, and weather that can change from scorching sun to freezing hail in a single hour. The land defies cultivation. Slopes are steep, water is scarce or inconsistent, and the soil is shallow. But high in these mountains, the Inca Empire built a civilization that not only survived but thrived. Their secret wasn't gold or conquest. It was agriculture specifically, the creation of one of the most sophisticated agricultural infrastructures the world has ever seen. The terraces, or andines, that climbed the Andes like vast green staircases. This first section explores how the Incas, with no draft animals, iron tools, or wheeled transport, engineered the impossible. Food security at 12,000 feet. Snow life at altitude. The Inca heartland lay in the highlands of modern-day Peru, particularly around Cusco, the empire's capital. This region rises well above 3,000 meters, 9,800 feet, where oxygen is thin and conventional farming nearly impossible. And yet, by the 15th century, the Incas had transformed it into a network of productive, sustainable fields. Unlike the more tropical lowlands of the Maya or the lake-fed plains of the Aztecs, the Inca had to contend with extreme elevation changes, temperature fluctuation within a single day, erosion and landslides due to seasonal rains, unpredictable frost. But they had something else too: deep empirical knowledge of their environment, accumulated over centuries by Andean peoples before them, and put to work on a monumental scale. What are terraces? Terracing is a simple idea with massive consequences. Imagine taking a steep slope and slicing it horizontally like a layer cake. Each slice becomes a flat platform, edged with stones, filled with fertile soil, and carefully leveled. Water is directed in or out through drainage channels, and the walls act as heat sinks, absorbing sunlight during the day and releasing it at night, minimizing frost. These terraces transformed useless hillsides into tiered farmlands capable of producing maize, quinoa, potatoes in hundreds of varieties, oca, aluco, and mashua Andean tubers, peanuts, beans, and even cotton at lower elevations. Each level of terrace could host a different crop, matched to its microclimate, elevation, and soil type. Brain Inca agricultural science. Inca terrace systems weren't just construction projects, they were experiments in environmental engineering. At Moray, northwest of Cusco, the Incas created what may have been an agricultural laboratory, a system of circular terraces descending into a natural depression. Each level has its own microclimate, with temperature variations of up to 5 degrees C, 9 degrees F, between top and bottom. Scholars believe Moray was used to test crop varieties, breeding strains of maize and potatoes that could survive at different altitudes. If this is true, it represents a level of state-sponsored agricultural science rivaling that of much later societies. Other sites like Pisac, Ollantaytambo, and Tapan show equally advanced features. Subsurface drainage systems, irrigation channels with controlled flow, stone-lined canals that directed mountain runoff, reservoirs and fountains for water storage. These were not mere survival mechanisms. They were investments in abundance. Person walking the human labor behind the walls. Terracing requires more than stone and soil. It requires people. Under the Inca Mita system, communities were required to contribute labor to state projects. Thousands of workers carved out slopes, hauled rocks, and filled in terraces, all without beasts of burden or wheels. Each stone wall was laid by hand. Each field was filled with soil, often carried from more fertile regions. Maintenance was constant. Landslides, heavy rains, or frost could damage walls or compact soil. Local communities rotated responsibility for upkeep, often tied to festivals and agricultural rituals. The terraces weren't just state projects, they were part of a living, seasonal rhythm of work. In many areas, workers also constructed windbreaks, frost barriers, and shaded areas using local vegetation. These subtle tools made survival possible in marginal lands. Seedling seed banks and storage. The Inca agricultural system didn't just produce food, it preserved it. Calcas or storehouses dotted the landscape. Built with ventilation and insulated walls, they stored dried potatoes, chuño, freeze-dried meat, charqui, maize, and seeds for future planting. Food grown in one region could be distributed across the empire through the Inca road system and llama caravans. Storage ensured that during crop failures or dry years, communities had reserves. This was not simply practical, it was political. By guaranteeing food security, the Inca state legitimized its rule and maintained loyalty from remote regions. Compass mapping an empire through altitude. Unlike other empires that expanded horizontally across similar climates, the Inca managed what scholars call vertical archipelagos. Each community occupied lands at multiple altitudes. High-altitude pastures for llamas and alpacas. Mid-elevation terraces for potatoes and tubers. Lower valleys for maize and fruit. Even coastal outposts for fish and salt. This vertical integration allowed communities to survive droughts or climate shifts by moving production up or down the mountains. Terraces were a key tool in this strategy, allowing Inca engineers to carve usable farmland into nearly any elevation, connecting communities across vertical space. Bricks a lasting legacy. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1530s, they marveled at Inca storehouses and fields. Some believed the Inca had food enough to feed an army for years. They had never seen such order in the face of such rugged terrain. Over time, colonialism disrupted the Midas system and many terraces were abandoned. Without regular maintenance, erosion reclaimed the slopes. Some walls crumbled, some canals filled with silt. But many terraces remain in use today. In rural Peru and Bolivia, indigenous farmers still plant potatoes on ancient walls. In recent decades, NGOs and local governments have invested in restoring Inca terraces to combat modern soil loss and climate change. These ancient technologies are not relics, they are solutions waiting to be used again. Sunrise over mountains, unresolved thought. The Inca didn't conquer nature. They worked with it, adapting to its challenges with patience, labor, and learning. They carved their survival into stone. So, in an age of climate disruption and food insecurity, what lessons lie hidden in the green staircases of the Andes? And can the past still feed the future? The towering terraces of the Inca world were more than feats of agricultural engineering. They were sacred landscapes, places where survival was not only practical but spiritual. To build and maintain a terrace was to participate in a relationship with the earth, the ancestors, and the gods. In this section, we move beyond construction and science and into the realm of ritual, belief, and meaning. The terraces were not neutral ground. They were infused with the cosmic order of the Andes, an order that made the act of farming a kind of prayer. Globe showing America's the Andean worldview. Aini, Pachamama, and reciprocity. Inca society was governed not just by politics, but by a deeply embedded cosmology rooted in the concept of reciprocity. Aini, the central principle of mutual exchange. You give and you receive. A neighbor helps you plant and you help them harvest. A community builds a terrace and the state provides food in hard times. Even nature followed this principle. Pachamama, often translated as Mother Earth. She was not a passive resource, but a living being. Farmers gave offerings to her before breaking the ground. Crops grew only with her blessing. Apis, the mountain spirits or deities who watched over each region. Each major peak had its own character, mood, and power. Some were generous, others jealous. Terraces built into the sides of mountains were not only functional, they were acts of respect, transforming the body of the mountain into fertile skin. Before planting, farmers would offer coca leaves, chicha, fermented maize beer, or llama fat to the earth. The rituals weren't mere tradition, they were seen as necessary to maintain harmony with the living landscape. Brick, sacred geometry in stone. The layout of terraces often followed cosmic alignments, reflecting a deep sense of order in Inca planning. Some terraces were curved to mimic the natural contours of the mountain, preserving the flow of energy, what the Andean peoples call salmonchakai. In places like Pisac and Tapan, terrace lines reflect solar movements, aligning with solstices or cardinal directions. Cusco, the imperial capital, was itself laid out in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal with various sectors corresponding to parts of the body. Terraces outside the city were integrated into this symbolic layout. In this way, terrace systems were both practical tools and ritual symbols. They created an ordered world where human activity was aligned with divine forces. Prayer beads agriculture and the Inca calendar. Inca agricultural life followed a ritual calendar, with planting and harvesting tied to celestial events and religious festivals. Inti Raymi, June solstice, the festival of the sun, marking the Inca New Year and the return of longer days. Offerings were made to Inti, the sun god, asking for fertile seasons. Capac Raymi, December solstice, linked with harvest preparation and rituals of purification. Wada Qhapek, the tying of the year, a time to reflect on past harvests and reset the cycle. Astronomers and priests tracked sunrise points along the horizon, using mountain peaks and built towers as markers. When the sun rose over a specific hill, they knew it was time to begin planting or offer specific sacrifices. These observations were passed on orally and embedded in songs, stories, and daily habits. The role of temples and shrines in agriculture. Terraces weren't isolated from spiritual structures. They were often built alongside or beneath shrines, huacas, and temples. Tipan, a ceremonial agricultural site southeast of Cusco, includes finely engineered terraces surrounded by fountains and temples, where water was both controlled and sanctified. Sacred springs, believed to be the tears of Pachamama, were integrated into terrace systems with ritual fountains, where offerings were left. Some terraces were known to be restricted for ceremonial planting, used only by priests or chosen maidens, akla, to grow crops for temple offerings or imperial feasts. These ritual crops were often grown with extra care and harvested with ceremony. The first potato of the season might be burned, buried, or offered to the gods before any human ate. Adult chief social stratification and the terrace economy. Not all terraces were created equal. Royal and temple terraces were the most elaborate, with carefully cut stones and optimal soil. Their crops often served the state or religion. Ilu terraces, community-based, were worked by local families, with produce shared among members. Mita terraces were worked for the state, and their yield stored in calcas or redistributed during shortages. This structure reflected a society without money or markets in the conventional sense. Instead, labor and surplus were tracked and redistributed based on obligation, favor, and need. Farming in this model was a form of civic participation. To till the land was to contribute to a wider system of shared prosperity, divine balance, and political loyalty. Chief of Rice climate control before climate science. The Incas did more than observe nature. They actively engineered microclimates using terraces and their environment. Stone walls absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, preventing frost damage. Windbreaks rows of vegetation, or earthworks protected fields from harsh mountain winds. Mulching with llama dung, or organic matter, conserved moisture. Canal-fed irrigation ensured that even in drought years, some fields stayed productive. By controlling altitude, sunlight exposure, water, and airflow, the Incas managed to grow multiple varieties of the same crop on a single hillside. This biodiversity was a hedge against pests, frost, and unpredictable weather. Their farming was resilient by design, based on observation, adaptation, and spiritual dialogue with the land. Potato, the sacred patay. No crop symbolized Inca agriculture more than the potato. Native to the Andes, potatoes were cultivated in hundreds of varieties, each adapted to a specific altitude and microclimate. Freeze-dried potatoes, chuño, could be stored for years, critical for highland survival. Certain potatoes were considered ritually significant, planted on sacred terraces, or used in ceremonies to honor Pachamama. Even today, indigenous farmers in the Andes maintain ancestral seed banks, preserving rare potato strains and continuing traditions that go back thousands of years. When modern researchers sought hardy crops for future food security, they turned to Peruvian potato farms still working land shaped by Inca hands. Mountain unresolved thought. To the Incas, farming wasn't just feeding bodies. It was feeding the cosmic order, maintaining the flow between humans, nature, and the divine. What happens to that order when the land is no longer sacred? And in a world of industrial farming, lost soils, and forgotten seeds, can the Andean terraces still teach us how to live with the earth, not just on it? The terraced hillsides of the Andes once sustained the mighty Inca Empire, feeding millions, supporting vast armies, and demonstrating a rare harmony between nature and state. But like all empires, the Inca fell. The Spanish arrived in the 1530s, bringing new gods, new diseases, and new systems of labor and land ownership that reshaped the Andes forever. The terraces did not disappear overnight, but their meaning, their maintenance, and their management changed. In this final section, we examine what happened to these remarkable structures after the fall of the Inca, how they have survived centuries of abandonment and erosion, and why they matter more than ever in the 21st century. The Inca Empire falls. When Francisco Pizarro and his men captured Atahualpa, the last sovereign Inca emperor, in 1532, it marked the beginning of a swift and brutal collapse of Inca political control. Spanish weapons and horses were formidable, but even more devastating were epidemics of smallpox and other diseases that decimated the Andean population. The Spanish were bewildered by the agricultural abundance of the empire they encountered. Some conquistadors noted how storehouses were stocked with freeze-dried potatoes, maize, and dried llama meat in quantities they could hardly comprehend. Yet, they lacked the will or the understanding to maintain the terrace systems that made it possible. As the Spanish imposed new systems of land tenure, including the encomienda, the communal maintenance of terraces eroded. The reciprocal labor systems, Ini and Mita, were replaced with forced labor directed toward mines rather than agriculture. Bricks terraces in decline. Over time, many terraces were abandoned. The loss of population due to epidemics meant there were fewer hands to maintain the walls and canals. Spanish landowners prioritized pasture over high-altitude crops, letting many terraces fall into disuse. Traditional water management systems were neglected, leading to erosion, flooding, and landslides. Without constant maintenance, terrace walls collapsed. Once a single segment failed, water and soil moved downhill, taking more of the structure with it. And yet, many terraces, especially those near Cusco, the Sacred Valley, and Lake Titicaca remained, partly because they were built so well and partly because local communities continued to use them despite colonial disruption. What had been a vast state-directed infrastructure shrank into a localized, community-managed tradition. Sheaf of rice persistent through tradition. Though the Inca Empire ended, Andean agricultural knowledge persisted in indigenous communities. Farmers continued to grow native crops, preserve local seed varieties, and plant sacred offerings in the soil. While some terraces crumbled, others remained in use not as imperial showpieces, but as lifelines. The ability to produce food at multiple altitudes, to prepare for climatic shifts, and to store surplus in times of need remained essential for survival. In many communities, festivals and planting rituals continued, honoring Pachamama, the Apis, and the agricultural calendar. Through oral tradition, ancestral knowledge of soil, weather, and seed was passed down even when the state systems that once organized it were gone. Chart decreasing the impact of modernization. By the 20th century, many Andean terraces had suffered further decline. Urban migration, drew young people away from agriculture. Commercial fertilizers and hybrid crops encouraged farming in valley floors instead of on high terraces. Terraces were seen as outdated, labor-intensive, and unprofitable. As globalization spread, so too did the perception that ancient technologies were backward, a relic of a less advanced time. Stone-walled terraces were left to fall apart, replaced by industrial agriculture on flatter, more accessible land. But this shift came at a cost: soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and growing food insecurity, especially in rural Andean communities. Globe showing Europe, Africa, a return to the terraces. In recent decades, the world has started to look again at Inca terraces not as ruins, but as resilient technologies with lessons for a planet in crisis. Faced with climate change, water shortages, soil degradation, loss of traditional crop varieties, governments, NGOs, and indigenous organizations have begun restoring terrace systems across Peru and Bolivia. Projects have included rebuilding terrace walls using traditional masonry techniques, restoring irrigation canals and water-sharing agreements, reviving native crops and indigenous seed banks, training local farmers in both ancestral and adaptive techniques. One such initiative, in the Cauca Valley of southern Peru, restored over 1,500 hectares of terraces. Farmers reported improved yields, better resistance to drought, and the return of community farming traditions. In this work, modern science is not replacing ancient knowledge, it is learning from it. DNA, agricultural biodiversity, and food security. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Inca terraces is their role in preserving biodiversity. By creating thousands of microclimates, terraces supported hundreds of potato varieties, multiple quinoa strains, climate-resilient Andean tubers. These crops are increasingly seen as essential for future food security, especially as monocultures fail under changing weather patterns. Seed-saving programs, like those at the International Potato Center in Lima, often rely on ancestral knowledge to identify, grow, and propagate hardy landraces. In a warming world, a terrace at 12,000 feet may offer more stability than a valley floor. Prayer beads spiritual revival. As the terraces return to use, so too do the rituals once tied to them. Farmers make offerings to Pachamama before planting seasons. Communities host Inti Raymi festivals, reintroducing solar calendars and agricultural cycles. Daykeepers and ritual specialists reestablish sacred ties between land, ancestors, and productivity. This revival is more than cultural nostalgia, it is an act of sovereignty, a decolonial practice, and a recognition that the past holds answers for the present. For many Quechua and Aymara farmers, the terraces are not ruins, they are evidence that the land still remembers. Mountain the sound of stone. Walk a restored terrace field today in the high Andes, and you might hear the wind brushing over stone walls built 500 years ago. Water running through hand-dug canals. The crunch of sandals on gravel paths used by ancestors. A farmer whispering thanks to the mountain as she drops seeds into the earth. These are not ghosts. They are continuity's proof that even after conquest and collapse, knowledge can persist, land can be healed, and the past can feed the future. Sunrise over mountains' final reflection, feeding the future. The Incas did not invent terracing, but they brought it to its peak, using it not only to feed an empire, but to embody a philosophy that humans and mountains are not separate, that farming is a relationship, not an extraction, and that engineering is not just about control but cooperation. In our own time, as we face ecological uncertainty, soil loss, and fragile food systems, we are left with a question. What would it mean to build again like the Incas, carefully, cooperatively, and in conversation with the land. Story 7. The Maya collapse, ecology, drought, and the end of cities. At their height between 250 and 900 CE, the Maya built sprawling cities in the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and western Honduras. These cities weren't isolated temples in the jungle, they were fully developed urban centers, complete with paved roads, public plazas, causeways, ball courts, aqueducts, and sprawling palace complexes. At places like Tikal, Calakmul, Capan, and Caracal, kings ruled over tens of thousands of subjects. They traded, they wrote, they fought, and they built monuments to themselves in stone. But by 900 CE, most of these cities had been abandoned. The classic Maya collapse is one of history's most enduring puzzles. For centuries, the jungle swallowed up their plazas and palaces, and scholars wondered, what happened? This first section explores the scale and character of Maya cities, the systems that made them thrive, and the early signs of strain before the great unraveling began. Classical: the rise of the classic Maya cities. The classic period, c. 250–900 CE, saw the explosion of urban life across the southern Maya lowlands. Dozens of city-states developed, each ruled by a Kayuhul Ajo, a holy lord, whose legitimacy was tied to divine ancestry, successful warfare, and the ability to perform key calendar rituals. Maya cities were not laid out like modern grid cities. They were organic, often spread across hilly terrain and arranged according to cosmic principles. Central plazas were lined with temples and stepped pyramids for rituals and elite burials. Palaces where royal families lived and governed. Ball courts were symbolic, and sometimes deadly games played out. Stele carved with historical and astronomical data. Surrounding these ceremonial cores were dense residential neighborhoods, filled with homes, workshops, and smaller shrines. These were not cities of a few priests and nobles, they were populous, complex urban environments. Ear of corn feeding the cities, agriculture and innovation. Building cities in the lowland tropics presented a significant challenge. How to feed large populations without rivers, plows, or draft animals. The Maya responded with ingenuity. Raised fields. In swampy areas like near Pultrauser Swamp, they built raised planting beds with canals for drainage and irrigation. Terracing. On slopes, they carved terraces to prevent erosion and conserve water. Aguadas and reservoirs. These man-made ponds collected and stored rainwater for dry seasons. Forest gardening. Maya farmers managed the rainforest like an orchard, encouraging the growth of useful plants like ramon trees, avocados, and chaya alongside their staple crops. Their primary food was maize, often consumed as tortillas or gruel, supplemented with beans, squash, manioc, chili peppers, and cacao. They also raised turkeys, ducks, and dogs, and hunted deer and peccaries. All this allowed cities like Tikal to grow to populations of 40,000–60,000, with even larger metropolitan regions surrounding them. Scroll politics and warfare. Maya politics were deeply fragmented. Each city-state claimed independence, and rulers often fought over trade routes, tribute, or dynastic prestige. Warfare was not total destruction, it was more ritualized, often aimed at capturing elites for ransom or sacrifice. But by the late Classic period, after 600 CE, warfare became more intense and widespread. Records from Tikal and Calakmul, a pair of rival superpowers, show cycles of alliance building, betrayal, and outright conquest. These conflicts often involved shifting alliances through strategic marriages, military expeditions that targeted rival dynasties, ceremonial battles tied to celestial omens and calendar dates. This constant tension may have overstretched cities' resources, as rulers focused more on political competition than ecological sustainability. Cloud rain and ritual. The importance of water. Perhaps no factor shaped Maya life more than the seasonal rainfall. The southern lowlands lacked major rivers. Instead, cities relied on rainwater stored in chultans, underground cisterns, and aguadas. Careful canal systems to divert and conserve water. Ceremonies to Chak, the rain god, especially during planting seasons. Rainfall was highly seasonal, generally from May to October. A few bad years of drought could lead to crop failure, famine, and political unrest. When rain failed, it wasn't just an agricultural disaster, it was a spiritual crisis, a sign that rulers had lost favor with the gods. By the late Classic period, inscriptions show a growing obsession with rituals to appease Chak, including massive ceremonies and human sacrifices. Some scholars argue this increasing religious desperation may have reflected ecological stress already underway. Chart decreasing early signs of decline. Before the final collapse, signs of strain began to appear. Increased warfare in inscriptions and archaeological evidence. Elaborate palaces built over older homes, signs of elite expansion at the expense of commoners. Malnutrition in skeletal remains, especially among non-elite burials. Soil exhaustion and deforestation in areas surrounding major cities. Fewer stelae erected in the late 800s, suggesting political instability or reduced central authority. Cities like Kapan began to see a decline in monument building, indicating shifts in political and religious order. Some leaders still performed rituals, but few are left behind the grand stelae and altars of their predecessors. And then quite suddenly, it all stopped. Derelict, the mysterious collapse. By the year 900 CE, most major cities in the southern lowlands, Tikal, Palenque, Kapan, Yaxchilan, were abandoned or severely depopulated. Their temples fell silent, canals dried, crops failed, the people moved elsewhere. This collapse wasn't a single event, it unfolded over decades and centuries, different in each city. Some held on longer, some collapsed rapidly, some, like Karakol, may have been burned or systematically dismantled. No single cause can explain the Maya collapse. Instead, it was likely a confluence of pressures. Environmental degradation, from deforestation and overfarming. Severe, prolonged droughts, identified through lake sediment and cave stalagmite. Political fragmentation and elite competition. Disruption of trade routes and alliances. Loss of confidence in ruling dynasties and religious legitimacy. As cities fell, populations likely migrated north to the Yucatan Peninsula, where new centers like Chichen Itza would later rise. The jungle reclaims. Once the cities were abandoned, the rainforest slowly reclaimed its own. Thatched homes rotted away within years. Stone structures began to crack under plant roots and shifting soils. Canals and reservoirs silted up, making agriculture difficult. Wildlife returned: howler monkeys, jaguars, birds hiding what had once been cities of tens of thousands. For centuries, locals knew of these ruins, sometimes incorporating them into folk legends, but much knowledge of the city's original purpose was lost. When European explorers stumbled across sites like Tikal and Palenque in the 18th and 19th centuries, they believed they had found lost cities of a vanished race. In truth, the Maya never vanished. They had simply moved, adapted, and in many ways endured. Unresolved thought. The fall of the classic Maya cities is not just a mystery of the past, it is a story of how power, environment, belief, and survival are entangled. What do we miss when we look only for a single cause of collapse? And could the long silence of Tikal's temples hold lessons for us today, living in cities that stretch across the earth, built on systems that may be more fragile than they appear? The classic Maya cities thrived in an environment that, on the surface, seemed unsuited for urban life. With no major rivers, poor soil, and highly seasonal rainfall, These cities depended on a delicate balance of engineering, agriculture, and ritual to survive. And for centuries, they did growing larger, more complex, and more interconnected. But prosperity can mask vulnerability. The very systems that supported Maya greatness were also fragile, especially in the face of environmental change. In this second section, we'll examine the climatic evidence for droughts during the Maya collapse, how deforestation and soil depletion magnified the crisis, and how the Maya themselves may have contributed to their own decline not through ignorance, but through overextension. The climate turns. In recent decades, scientists have found compelling evidence that the Maya collapse coincided with a period of intense and prolonged drought, using a variety of data sources, including sediment cores from lake beds, which reveal drops in water level and changes in vegetation, speleothems, stalagmites and stalactites from caves, whose growth patterns reflect rainfall, pollen records showing shifts in forest cover and agriculture. Researchers have identified multiple drought events between 800 and 1100 CE. These weren't just dry seasons, they were decades-long reductions in rainfall, affecting both agriculture and water storage systems. For a society deeply dependent on rain, the consequences were profound. Crop failures led to famine. Stored water in aguadas and reservoirs ran dry. Ritual offerings to the gods failed to bring rain, undermining royal legitimacy. Cities dependent on dense populations and intensive agriculture could no longer support themselves. Even resilient cities like Tikal and Kapan, once rich in monuments and power, began to shrink, fragment, or vanish. Deciduous tree, the role of deforestation. While drought may have triggered the collapse, the landscape itself was already stressed. To grow maize and build monumental cities, the Maya cleared large areas of forest they needed. Firewood for cooking and construction. Lime plaster for stuccoing buildings, made by burning limestone, an extremely wood-intensive process. Farming space for their expanding populations. Archaeologists studying sediment near Maya cities have found clear evidence of sharp declines in forest pollen, increased presence of weedy plants associated with disturbed soils, soil erosion, as forest cover was removed from steep slopes. In the uplands, thin tropical soils eroded quickly when exposed. In lowland areas, removing trees disrupted the water cycle, reducing humidity, decreasing local rainfall, and increasing the effects of drought. In effect, the Maya may have helped amplify the very droughts that undermined them. Monumental growth, silent decline. One of the most puzzling features of the Maya collapse is its slow motion. Cities didn't fall in a day. Instead, they experienced reduced construction, fewer new monuments and palaces, declining artistic quality in carvings and murals, abandoned stelae that record unfinished reigns or incomplete rituals, less frequent calendrical inscriptions, suggesting a weakening grasp on cosmic order. Cities like Dos Pilas, once powerful, were abandoned and burned. Inscriptions from the site suggest internal conflict between rival factions, perhaps sparked by a failing food supply or weakened elite authority. Even as some areas declined, others like Sable experienced brief revivals, often under new leadership or through migrant resettlement from neighboring regions. These surges suggest that collapse was uneven. Some cities attempted to adapt or restructure, while others simply disappeared. Brain, were the Maya aware? One might wonder, did the Maya understand what was happening? Did they know the forests were thinning, the soils weakening, the rains failing? The answer is likely yes, but with limits. The Maya were keen observers of the natural world. Their calendars, astronomy, and agricultural practices all show a deep understanding of seasonal rhythms, plant behavior, and environmental signs. Their ritual cycles were designed to maintain balance with nature, not dominate it. However, they lacked a system-wide view. City-states operated independently, often in competition. There was no centralized authority capable of coordinating ecological preservation or water management across regions. In this way, the Maya may have been trapped in a familiar human pattern. Local success, global vulnerability. Each city did what it needed to survive, even if that meant overusing resources or engaging in wars that stressed the larger system. Fire, the end of ritual power. As the environment declined, so too did the ritual structure of Maya society. Maya kings derived their power not from wealth or violence alone, but from their ability to intercede with the gods. They performed bloodletting rituals, calendar ceremonies, and astronomical alignments to ensure cosmic order. Their legitimacy was sacred. But when the rains failed and the crops died, so did belief. Rulers no longer appeared as chosen intermediaries. Their rituals lost their effectiveness. Inscriptions from the late classic period reflect this shift. Fewer show confident kings in triumphant poses. More depict warfare, captivity, or silence. As cities emptied, temples were left unmaintained. Ball courts grew weeds, altars cracked. The elaborate ritual economy of classic Maya civilization imploded, unable to function without environmental cooperation. Where did the people go? Despite the collapse of cities, the Maya people did not vanish. Many migrated north, toward the more arid but resilient Yucatan Peninsula. Others returned to rural village life, focusing on subsistence farming and local trade. Some may have formed smaller polities without monumental architecture or literacy, thus leaving fewer traces. A few cities, like Uxmal and Chichen Itza, rose to prominence in the post-classic period with different architectural styles and political models. In the northern lowlands, cities began to reflect Toltec influence from central Mexico, showing that Maya identity persisted, but transformed. The collapse of the classic world wasn't the end of Maya culture. It was a reorganization, a shift from grand cities to resilient communities, from sacred kings to localized governance. Globe with meridians, a broader collapse. The Maya weren't the only civilization to suffer during this period. Around the same time, between 800 and 1000 CE, other complex societies experienced turmoil. The Tang dynasty in China collapsed amid rebellion and regional fragmentation. The Abbasid Caliphate entered a long period of decline. The ancestral Pueblones in the American Southwest began abandoning major settlements. In Europe, the Carolingian Empire fractured after Charlemagne's death. Some scholars suggest a broader pattern of climatic instability, tied to the medieval climate anomaly, a period marked by irregular rainfall, warming, and localized droughts across the globe. In this sense, the Maya collapse wasn't isolated. It was part of a global moment of stress, where environment and empire clashed with lasting consequences. Sheaf of rice, unresolved thought. The Maya built cities in a rainforest, carved time into stone, and tracked the heavens with uncanny precision. But when the skies withheld rain and the forest ceased to give, the balance broke. So we are left to wonder, what does it mean for a civilization to grow beyond the limits of its landscape? And what wisdom remains hidden in the ruins etched in stone and buried in soil for those of us who may be closer to collapse than we realize? When the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands crumbled, it wasn't the end, it was a transformation. In the final section of this story, we move beyond collapse to explore the continuity of Maya life. We examine how traditions persisted after the fall of kings and temples, how new cities emerged with different structures and beliefs, and how against the odds the Maya identity endured colonization, displacement, and modernity. Because the Maya did not disappear, they still walk their land, they still speak their languages, their history did not end, it evolved. National life after collapse. By the early 10th century, many classic cities like Tikal, Kapan, and Palenque were largely abandoned. The monumental architecture ceased. The elaborate calendrical inscriptions ended. The vast trade networks that had once connected city-states fragmented. Yet archaeological and linguistic evidence shows that many smaller communities continued. Rural villages persisted in the forested hills, relying on local farming, hunting, and forest resources. Traditional crops maize, beans, squash, and cassava remained staples. Sacred groves, cenotes, and cave shrines continued to be used for rituals. Religious practices evolved but did not vanish. These communities may have been disconnected from elite dynastic culture, but they preserved knowledge, stories, and a way of life suited to the land. Collapse wasn't extinction, it was deurbanization, a shift away from empire, not from existence. Classical the post-classic, new powers rise. Out of the silence of the classic collapse, new cities and centers emerged, especially in the northern Yucatan. Chichén Itzá, one of the most iconic Maya sites, rose to prominence between 900 and 1200 CE. Its architecture reflects both Maya and Toltec influences, such as feathered serpent imagery and colonnaded halls. Uxmal, Mayapan, and other northern cities formed new political and economic alliances, often more confederated than centralized. The post-classic Maya were more militarized, and their urban centers were often fortified, suggesting a new period of political instability and competition. These cities maintained many classic Maya traditions: calendar use, ritual centers, astronomy, but they also incorporated new trade goods, like metal tools, and different religious iconography influenced by Central Mexican cultures. In short, the Maya adapted. They reorganized politically and absorbed new ideas, demonstrating a remarkable flexibility in the wake of collapse. Scroll the Spanish encounter. When the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, the Maya world was still very much alive, though fragmented. At that time, dozens of Maya kingdoms and city-states ruled across the Yucatan and highland Guatemala. These included Itzá of Teazal, one of the last independent kingdoms, conquered in 1697. Caich, who ruled in the Guatemalan highlands. Yucatec Mapan Quexa, and many others. The Spanish conquest of the Maya region took nearly 2 centuries. Unlike the Inca or Aztec, whose central governments were overthrown quickly, the Maya resisted fiercely through guerrilla warfare, strategic alliances, and retreat into dense forests. But conquest eventually came. It brought forced conversions to Christianity, destruction of codices and temples, new diseases that devastated populations, the encomienda system, which exploited indigenous labor. Yet even under these pressures, Maya traditions continued, often in secret or adapted forms. Brain knowledge preserved. The destruction of Maya books, codices, by Spanish friars like Diego de Landa was devastating. Centuries of written knowledge gone in flames. Yet Maya knowledge didn't vanish. It endured through oral tradition, stories, calendar lore, and medical practices passed down through generations. Symbolic resistance, integrating Christian saints with Maya deities. Surviving codices. 4 known pre-Columbian books remain: Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Grolier, offering precious insight into astronomy, ritual, and prophecy. Language. Over 30 Maya languages are still spoken today, carrying cosmology, identity, and wisdom. In the Popol Vuh, a sacred Caich text recorded after the conquest, we find deep cosmological insights that survived colonial repression: stories of creation, struggle, sacrifice, and renewal. Ear of Corn, agricultural continuity. Despite invasions, famines, and forced labor, the Maya people continued to farm their land. They maintained milpa cycles, rotating fields of maize, beans, and squash. Forest gardens, encouraging biodiversity and food security. Sacred planting rituals, offering food or prayers to the earth before sowing. Maya agriculture has proved remarkably resilient, precisely because it was designed for sustainability, not profit. Techniques like swidden agriculture, terracing, and raised fields are still used in parts of Chiapas, Guatemala, and Belize. These aren't primitive practices, they're adaptive technologies, shaped by centuries of experience. Calendar, the long count, and the 2012 myth. The Maya calendar drew global attention in the early 21st century, when the end of a long count cycle in 2012 was widely misinterpreted as a doomsday prophecy. In truth, the Maya calendar was cyclical, not apocalyptic. The end of the 13th Baktan, a 394-year period, was a cause for reflection and renewal, not destruction. Modern Maya communities marked the date with ceremonies and gatherings, emphasizing cultural survival, not cosmic death. The 2012 phenomenon revealed more about Western misunderstanding than about Maya belief. Yet it also reminded the world that the Maya had mastered astronomy, mathematics, and timekeeping in ways that remain astonishing. Footprints: the living Maya. Today, an estimated 6 to 7 million Maya people live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They are farmers, teachers, activists, healers, and spiritual leaders. Speakers of languages like Quechua, Yucatec Maya, Mam, Quanjabal, and many more. Keepers of ancestral knowledge, surviving colonization, war, and marginalization. They face many challenges: poverty, land loss, discrimination, and climate change. But they also lead movements for indigenous rights, linguistic preservation, and environmental stewardship. In the highlands of Guatemala, daykeepers still perform ceremonies on mountaintops. In Chiapas, Maya cooperatives blend traditional farming with sustainable development. In Belize, cultural festivals celebrate dance, food, and storytelling that stretches back millennia. The cities may have fallen, but the people remain. Moai final reflection: the myth of collapse. The collapse of the classic Maya cities was dramatic, but it was not an ending. It was a pivot, a reconfiguration, a shedding of one form for another. In a world obsessed with rise and fall, with glory and ruin, the Maya story offers something different. A civilization that endured not by dominating nature, but by adapting to it. A people who preserved their identity not in monuments, but in memory. A culture that teaches us that survival is not always loud, it is sometimes quiet, rooted, and persistent. So perhaps the question is not why the Maya cities fell, but how their people never did. Story 8. Aztec marketplaces bartering in the shadow of temples. In the grand narrative of the Aztec Empire with its temple pyramids, ritual warfare, and imperial conquest, one often overlooked yet vital element was the marketplace. To understand how the Aztecs thrived, one must look not only to their gods and emperors, but also to their traders, weavers, farmers, and fishmongers. At the core of this daily commerce was Tlatelolco, the most famous and immense of all Aztec markets. It wasn't just a place to buy food or exchange goods, it was the economic engine of an empire, a site of social gathering, political control, and remarkable logistical coordination. In this section, we'll step into the dust and noise of an ordinary Aztec day at Tlatelolco and discover how marketplaces, though mundane, were central to the survival and function of the Aztec world. Cityscape: twin cities, Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, founded on an island in Lake Texcoco in the early 14th century, was a marvel of urban planning. But its twin, Tlatelolco, located just to the north, had an identity of its own. Originally an independent city, Tlatelolco was eventually absorbed by Tenochtitlan in 1473, but it retained its distinct role as the commercial hub of the empire. If Tenochtitlan was the seat of religious and political power, Tlatlauco was its economic pulse. Each day, thousands of people would journey across causeways, canals, and dike-lined walkways to enter the bustling market square of Tlatlauco. Spanish chroniclers were awed by its scale. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who accompanied Hernán Cortés, described the market as larger and more organized than anything he had seen in Europe, comparing it favorably to markets in Seville. Shopping what was sold. The marketplace offered a staggering variety of goods. There was no currency in the form we know today. Barter was the norm, although certain items served as mediums of exchange, such as cacao beans, cotton cloaks called quachli, small copper axes or bells. Vendors offered items ranging from the everyday to the luxurious. Foodstuffs: maize, beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, salt, honey, cactus fruit, fish, shrimp, ducks, frogs, and edible insects, tortillas hot off clay griddles, crafts and textiles, pottery, obsidian tools and baskets, colorful woven garments, cloaks and sandals, feathers especially from exotic birds like quetzals, jewelry of jade, turquoise, and gold, though gold was more ornamental than currency, utilities and livestock, firewood, charcoal, lime for building, dogs, a food source, turkeys and zalitzcuntly, hairless dogs, reeds, rushes, and construction materials, medicinals and ritual goods, herbs, resins, and pigments, incense, copal, and ritual paper, skulls, bones, or preserved animal parts used in ceremonies. The diversity of goods reflected a highly interconnected empire. Items came from highland farms, tropical forests, desert zones, and coastal regions, an economic network made possible by tribute, trade, and the sophisticated Pachteca merchant class. Busts in silhouette who came to market. The Tlatlauco marketplace wasn't just a venue for elite merchants. It served all levels of society, each with its own social and economic rhythm. Peasants and farmers arrived early with baskets of surplus crops or woven mats to trade. Artisans sold crafted goods, obsidian knives, painted gourds, or fine textiles. Specialists offered services: barbers, scribes, fortune-tellers, and herbalists. Nobles and priests might attend to make bulk purchases or commission luxuries. Merchants Pachteca arrived from far regions, often with guards and porters bearing tribute-level goods. Even judges were present, stationed in the market to resolve disputes and enforce fair trade practices. If a merchant cheated a customer, he might face punishment right there, in the market plaza, under public view. 4 o'clock when and how often? Markets in the Aztec world operated on a 5-day cycle, known as the Macuili tonally. Most towns held markets every 5th day, but Tlatlauco was daily, with the largest crowds gathering on the 5th day rotation when regional sellers arrived. This cycle allowed for an organized distribution of goods throughout the valley. Merchants could follow a pattern of market days from town to town: Tlatlauco, Texcoco, Tlacopan, and beyond, ensuring widespread availability of products and a rotating commercial presence. Balance the organization of the market. What made the marketplace so efficient was its strict organization. The Aztecs were meticulous record keepers and administrators, and their market system reflected this. Vendors were grouped by the type of good they sold. All food vendors in one quadrant, textile dealers in another, tool makers in another still. A designated area for slaves, Tlacopan, where those in debt bondage could be sold or redeemed. Rules governed weights and measures, and inspectors, calpics, monitored activity. Price gouging or theft was taken seriously. Minor violations might result in fines. Major ones could lead to public humiliation or corporal punishment. Unlike chaotic medieval European markets, Aztec markets were, By most accounts, calm, orderly, and surprisingly quiet. Traders spoke in respectful tones. Haggling existed, but it was not raucous. The tone matched the setting. Markets were seen as sacred spaces, as much a part of social cohesion as temples or palaces. Motorway Pachteca, merchants of empire. Perhaps the most fascinating participants in the Aztec economic system were the Pachteca, long-distance professional merchants who carried goods across the empire and beyond. Pachteca were more than traders. They were diplomats, sometimes acting as spies or envoys for the Tlatoni emperor. They organized into guilds with their own patron deities, rules, and laws. They could amass wealth and status, even as commoners unusual in Aztec society. Some were armed caravans, traveling in large groups for protection. They brought luxury goods: jade, quetzal feathers, rare shells, gold dust from distant lands like the Maya territories or Mixtec highlands. Their journeys might take weeks, crossing deserts, mountains, and enemy zones. Tlatelolco was their central hub. Here, goods were offloaded, taxes were assessed, and trade routes were plotted anew. Money bag economy without coins. The Aztecs lacked a coin-based system, yet trade flourished. Instead, they relied on standardized barter, symbolic currency, and tribute. Cacao beans served as a unit of exchange. 100 beans might buy a turkey hen or a small cloak. Cotton cloaks, quachli, had standardized values and were often used for larger transactions. Tribute from conquered regions fed directly into the economy, redistributed through state stores or sold in markets. Without banks or coinage, the system relied on memory, oral agreements, and trusted reputation. Merchants kept detailed mental ledgers, and high-value transactions were witnessed by market judges. This decentralized system allowed for flexibility and resilience, particularly important in a vast and diverse empire, with hundreds of ethnic groups and dialects. Sunrise unresolved thought. In the shadow of the Templo Mayor, where sacrifices were offered to gods, ordinary life unfolded with quiet discipline and endless exchange. People bought tortillas, bartered for sandals, gossiped with neighbors, and passed judgments beneath awnings of woven reeds. What does it say about a civilization when the true strength of its empire lies not in its warriors, but in its weavers, sellers, and silent merchants? And how do we understand power differently when we consider that the heartbeat of empire might echo most clearly in the rhythm of a crowded marketplace? The market of Tlatelolco and others like it were not isolated affairs. They existed at the intersection of everyday necessity and imperial ambition. Through them flowed not just food and tools, but tribute, political power, and social order. In this section, we look deeper into the economic system of the Aztec Empire, exploring how markets were shaped by tribute and taxation, how people at every level of society relied on market access, and how these economic flows helped knit together a vast and diverse empire until they didn't. Behind the scenes of obsidian knives and maize baskets lay something more profound, a finely tuned economy running on ritual, barter, and the daily efforts of common people. Classical empire funded by tribute. At the heart of Aztec imperial economics was tribute. When the Aztecs conquered a new region, they didn't always displace local rulers. Instead, they imposed a tributary obligation, requiring provinces to deliver goods on a regular schedule. These goods were not random, they were meticulously recorded, often displayed pictorially in tribute codices like the Codex Mendoza. Tribute items included cotton cloths, often in the thousands, maize beans and chilies, cacao beans from tropical zones, feathers, jaguar skins, and live animals, salt, obsidian, lime, and building materials, weapons and war supplies. Tribute was brought to Tenochtitlan, often stored in massive warehouses for redistribution to temples, nobles, soldiers, and state officials. Some surplus ended up in the markets, where it entered local economies. This system allowed the Aztecs to feed their cities, reward their warriors, and display their power through material abundance, all without a centralized coinage system. Adult chief the commoner's economy. Most Aztecs weren't priests, warriors, or merchants. They were Macehualtan commoners who farmed chinampas, harvested maguey, and made tortillas. For them, the market was essential. A place to trade surplus maize or fish for salt, pottery, or woven sandals. An opportunity to sell prepared food, clothing, or tools for extra income. A social hub where news traveled faster than the flow of tribute. Commoners didn't often handle tribute themselves, but they felt its effects. Tribute demands pulled labor away from local communities. A bad harvest could mean falling short and facing punishment. Yet markets gave them access to goods from across the empire, items they could never produce themselves. Markets were also spaces of female economic activity. Many vendors were women, especially in food stalls, textile sales, and herbal medicine. A skilled tortilla maker or weaver might earn more than her husband on market days. In this way, Aztec markets were not just economic engines, they were tools of social stability, giving everyday people a stake in the empire's success. Knew how goods traveled. The Aztec Empire had no wheels, no draft animals, and no metal carts. So how did goods move from the tropics to the valley, from mountains to chinampas? By foot, by canoe, and by pure coordination. Tileme were human porters who carried goods on their backs using tump lines across their foreheads. They were everywhere in markets, on roads, climbing mountains. Canoes traversed Lake Texcoco and surrounding water systems. Flat-bottomed, they could carry hundreds of pounds of goods to the central docks of Tlatlauco and Tenochtitlan. Roads and causeways, while modest compared to Inca or Roman systems, connected major urban and rural areas, with resting stations for travelers and merchants. There were no pack animals, yet this human-scale system was astonishingly effective. It allowed tropical cacao beans and coastal shells to arrive in the highlands within days, feeding both the market stalls and the elite's demand for exotic prestige items. Measuring without money. Aztec markets operated largely without currency, relying on standardized barter and widely understood values. Some common valuations might look like this. 1 tamale equals 1 cacao bean. 20 cacao beans equals a small rabbit. 100 cacao beans equals a good cotton cloak. 8,000 cacao beans equals a canoe full of maize. 1 quachli cotton cloth equals could be used to pay taxes or settle legal fines. To prevent exploitation, market judges were present to oversee fairness. They mediated disputes, approved weights and measures, and recorded violations. This system required collective trust and shared knowledge. Merchants and buyers needed to remember conversion rates, know the quality of goods, and understand local customs. Despite the absence of coins, the market economy was both sophisticated and dependable. Shield market law and order. Markets weren't just marketplaces, they were also legal spaces. The presence of market judges, Tianquispan Tilamatini, helped maintain order and prevent chaos. Penalties for violations could be serious. Cheating on weights or measures might result in a public shamming or beatings. Stealing in the market was punished swiftly, often by execution for repeat offenders. Sellers of spoiled food could be fined or banned. False advertising, like selling painted rocks as valuable stones, was also punishable. But the enforcement wasn't just top-down. Communities had their own merchant guilds, neighborhood alliances, and collective standards. People policed themselves because trust was currency, and reputation was worth more than cacao beans. Abacus when the system strains. Despite its resilience, the Aztec market economy was not invulnerable. Droughts and famine strained food supplies, making maize prices volatile. Tribute burdens grew heavier under emperors like Ahuitzotl and Moctezuma II, increasing pressure on peasants. Military expansion disrupted local markets and trade routes, particularly in rebellious provinces. Moreover, the system relied on constant motion of people, goods, and information. If a war or natural disaster cut off even one link, entire chains of exchange could suffer. Spanish observers noted that by the time Cortés arrived, resentment in tributary regions was growing. While markets still functioned, the flow of goods masked deeper inequities and vulnerabilities beneath the surface. Chart decreasing a glimpse of the collapse. When the Spaniards attacked Tenochtitlan in 1521, they didn't just bring swords and steel, they brought disruption to the entire economic ecosystem. Lake canoes were sunk or commandeered. Farmers and merchants fled or starved. The market's once daily hubs of order shut down. Supply lines broke under siege. By the end of the conquest, not only was the Templo Mayor destroyed, but Tlatelolco's market lay in ruins. The beating heart of the Aztec economy had gone silent. Candle unresolved thought. The marketplaces of the Aztecs were vast, structured, and remarkably human, built on barter, trust, and rhythm. But like so many things in history, their strength also contained their fragility. What happens to an empire when the everyday stops? When the quiet hum of buying and selling falters, and the sound of footsteps through market dust gives way to silence? Perhaps in the ruins of Tlatelolco, beneath the buried stalls and crumbled walls, we are left with this lingering truth. It is not only temples and kings that define a civilization. It is also the places where people gather, trade, argue, and feed their children again, and again, and again. Tlatelolco fell, along with Tenochtitlan, in 1521. The Spanish siege didn't just end an empire, it disrupted a way of life that had revolved around ritual, routine, and resilience. In this final section, we explore what happened to Aztec marketplaces after the conquest, how memory of that economy endured through colonial pressure, and how the humble acts of buying and selling shaped a world far larger than any emperor could. Because marketplaces are more than places, they are habits. They persist in minds, in rhythms, and in the human drive to gather, exchange, and survive. Derelict after the fall. The siege of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco left the city physically and spiritually shattered. Chinampas were destroyed or abandoned. Causeways were broken. Temples were toppled. And the once orderly market plazas were burned, looted, or buried under rubble. In the immediate aftermath, the surviving population was starving. Tributes stopped. Canoes no longer arrived. Porters and vendors disappeared. What had once been a daily act of life, going to market, was suddenly impossible. Spanish accounts note that the city fell quiet, not just from the loss of leadership, but from the loss of motion. It wasn't just political collapse, it was economic silence. But silence does not mean extinction. Threads of continuity. Despite the conquest, markets returned. Over time, people gathered again, this time under the eyes of Spanish friars and colonial officials. They brought maize, chilies, mats, and baskets. They rebuilt stalls, remade pathways, and resumed the ancient rhythm of exchange. Though the colonial system introduced new rules, taxes, and monetary currency, Spanish reals, for example, it did not erase indigenous practices overnight. In many towns, markets continued to be held on 5-day cycles. Goods were still grouped by type, just as in the old days. Cacao beans remained in use as informal currency in rural areas. Nahuatl remained the language of commerce well into the colonial period. Even the Spaniards came to rely on local markets. These bustling centers offered efficient distribution of food, crafts, and labor. For all their contempt for Aztec rituals, Spanish colonialists could not ignore the practical genius of its economic organization. Globe showing Europe-Africa a broader exchange emerges. Colonial markets introduced new products into the economic fabric. Livestock, pigs, chickens, cattle. New crops, wheat, barley, sugarcane. Metal tools and cooking pots. Glass beads, cloth, European dyes. In return, native goods spread across the empire. Cacao, originally prized by Maya and Aztec elites, became a colonial luxury. Indigenous textiles and dyes found their way to Europe. Market vendors adapted, mixing old and new economies. In many ways, the Aztec marketplace became the foundation for a broader colonial economy, one that blended systems without fully replacing them. The daily acts of buying, bartering, and trading remained central not as resistance, but as persistence. Adult medium, women, vendors, and quiet resistance. Aztec markets had always been spaces of female economic power. In the colonial period, this persisted. Women vendors sold food, textiles, and medicine. Many learned enough Spanish and Nahuatl to navigate dual legal systems. Some earned more income than their male relatives, especially widows and single mothers. Others became cultural intermediaries, bridging traditional healing practices with European medicine. Markets allowed women to maintain autonomy. While the colonial government imposed taxes and restrictions, many vendors continued selling from their doorways, from reed mats in plazas, or even traveling from town to town. In these quiet, everyday acts, we see a form of economic resistance not by force, but by continuity, by refusing to disappear. Books, memory in codices, and oral tradition. Though many pre-Hispanic codices were destroyed, colonial-era codices like the Florentine Codex recorded rich descriptions of market life, often in the words of Nahua informants. Through them we know how goods were arranged, what prices were fair, which foods were freshest, what sounds filled the air. Oral histories also played a vital role. In small villages and family circles, elders told stories of how markets used to be, how far porters traveled, what Quatchley could buy, and which days were sacred for trade. These stories were not romantic nostalgia, they were living instructions, passed from one generation to the next, instructions for how to survive. House marketplaces today. Modern Mexico and Central America still reflect the legacy of Aztec marketplaces. In many towns, weekly or 5-day tianguis, open-air markets continue. Indigenous women still weave, cook, and sell in the same patterns as their ancestors. Nahuatl and other native languages are spoken as much in market stalls as in homes. Traditional foods, herbs, and crafts continue to be valued not just as commodities, but as identity. Markets remain spaces of community and culture, especially for indigenous peoples. Even as globalization brings supermarkets and malls, the tianguis holds on not as a relic, but as a choice. A choice to remember, a choice to remain. Brain, what do markets teach us? There is something deceptively profound about a marketplace. In its noise and smell, its barter and rhythm, it reveals how people organize survival. Markets are spaces of trust where fairness is expected, spaces of memory where old patterns persist, spaces of resilience where people adapt to hardship through movement, trade, and connection, spaces of humanity where everyone needs something, and everyone has something to offer. For the Aztecs, the market was more than an economic tool, it was a moral and cosmological institution. A space where order was enforced, fairness was sacred, and survival was collective. Sunrise final reflection, the market as monument. When we think of empires, we often picture temples, armies, and rulers, but perhaps the true monuments are less visible. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Aztec world isn't the Templo Mayor or Moctezuma's palace, It's the pattern of footsteps still found in dusty market squares, where voices still rise over piles of maize, bundles of herbs, and hand-woven cloth. A market is not just a place. It's a pattern, a rhythm of trust, exchange, and continuity that can survive even the fall of empires. And in that rhythm, quietly persistent across centuries, lies the heartbeat of history.